Jeff Mullen. I'm a partner at Foley Hoag, and I want to welcome all of you to our offices. It's a terrific turnout for a Friday morning, and owing to the importance of this matter, I also want to acknowledge Kathleen Brill, my partner, who's been very active in the forum. Kathleen, stand up, Kathleen. Particularly happy to hear from Rachel and my friends Iram and Scott, our client Scott from the MBTA, about these important matters, and look forward and encourage these kinds of conversations which combine climate, energy, and environmental issues with our transportation network, which are so critical for today's times. So with that, I'm going to ask Indrani, program sponsor, to come up and make a few words. Indrani?
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks a lot, Gabriella, Anne, and Jeff, for getting us started with the forum. Good morning, everyone. Good morning on this bright, beautiful Friday morning. Beautiful view, breathtaking view outside. Jeff and Kathleen, again, thanks so much for extending this space to us. I'm truly thrilled here to be in front of such a dynamic group of professionals. At Weston & Sampson, we firmly believe that resilience is not just a goal, but a critical path forward. We see firsthand how innovative solutions paired with sustainable financing can empower communities to withstand the challenge of the challenges that we're facing from climate change. The urgency of today's forum cannot be overstated. According to a recently published NOAA report in 2024, in 2023 alone, the United States experienced 28 separate record-breaking weather and climate disasters, from hurricanes, floods, wildfires, and droughts, which collectively cost over $100 billion and tragically took hundreds of lives. Globally, the numbers are even more staggering. Climate disasters have displaced approximately 21.5 million people annually over the last decade. But what does inaction cost at the project scale that we work on? Research from FEMA have shown that for every $1 invested in resilience measures, that saves $6 in recovery costs. And yet many promising projects stall due to gaps in financing. And that is where innovation comes into play. Creative financing mechanisms like green bonds, public-private partnerships, layered capital stacks, all of which we're here to listen more today, can unlock those resources and can turn ambitious adaptation plans from planning documents to implementable projects. And today we're here to explore how practitioners, municipalities, and state agencies, private entities as well, can leverage those tools to drive change. From understanding the economics of climate adaptation to designing projects that attract investment, the discussions this morning will provide us a roadmap for hearing what we can do to move the needle for climate resilience. I'd like to take a moment again to thank our organizers, EBC, in partnership with the Sustainable Solutions Lab, along with Foley Hoag, for creating this space to tackle and discuss these issues. And I would like to thank my co-chair, Carrie, for all her efforts in putting this panel together. And last but not the least at all, I would like to express my heartfelt thanks to the incredible lineup of speakers that we have today, the valuable insights that we will hear related to economic modeling, the innovative transit-oriented development and strategies that make projects investment ready. We're not just here to examine, today we will examine not just the risks of inaction, but the transformative power of what we can do when we do it right with the right resources. I encourage everyone to ask questions, to engage, to think about how we can fund and sustain this resilient future that we envision, because the stakes are certainly very high, but so is the potential for progress. Thank you, and I look forward to diving into the program with you. With that, I'll pass it off to my co-chair, Carrie.
Thank you so much, Indrani, and thank you for tackling this with me today. Welcome, everybody. For those who don't know me, my name is Carrie Hewitt. I'm Chief Regeneration Officer with Planning Communities. And yes, again, thank you, Indrani, for working on this with me. we were both, I think, really interested in co-chairing this particular topic, not because either of us are necessarily experts in this space, but because we wanted to learn from this incredible lineup of speakers that we have for you today. It would be probably a gap in our introduction to this program if we didn't mention the elephant in the room of the fact that we are not going to see the same level of federal investment in resilience in the next several years as we have seen historically over the past 4 years. And to me, that is disappointing, but also hopefully motivating for all of us in this room and all of you online to get creative, to think about collaborative partnerships that we can form. And I think we'll hear some good examples of those today. Not just operating within our own silos or expecting money to fall out of the sky for us, but to really dig in, get creative with our financing mechanisms, get creative with our approaches, and really work together to figure out how we're going to continue to invest in this critical space of resilience. We are really blessed to have this incredible lineup of speakers today. I think that we have lined up folks who are going to be able to speak from multiple sectors, including academic perspective, institutional perspective, folks who have created tools, people in finance. And I will start by introducing our first speaker of the day, Dr. Rachel Bouvier. And Rachel is an associate professor of economics at the University of Southern Maine. Go Black Bears? Huskies. different Maine school. Clearly, I don't know. Rachel brings a really unique perspective as both a professor and a practitioner, having worked as a consultant and focusing on the relationship between resiliency, community development, economic resiliency, sustainability, and figuring out how we can apply that. And I think we'll dig into what's really at stake for us for the cost of not taking action. And I think Indrani did a really great job highlighting some of those costs that we've seen in just the past year and we'll continue to see. I will also share just a personal note that I discovered in this process that Rachel and I also went to the same undergraduate alma mater, Smith College. So go Pioneers, I know that one. And actually lived in the same house. So it's great to come full circle in this larger community of ours. And without further ado, I'm going to let Rachel share her wisdom with us.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. I am not used to talking with a microphone, but I'm told that I need to in order for the people online to hear us. So I will do my best. So without further ado, yes. Okay, there we go. So the title of my presentation here is the Dollars and Cents of Resilience. Doing a little pun there because this has a pun in the title. So I thought, okay, I'll keep up the puns. The economic case for adaptation investments. And as Carrie said, I am associate professor of economics at the University of Southern Maine, and also am president of R. Bouvier Consulting. So I do a little bit of consulting as well. So the goal of today's presentation is to kind of give a high level view, place climate resilience in context, and to kind of set the stage for the next speakers, because the next speakers are going to be delving more into kind of the nitty gritty of today's topic. So here we go. Okay, great. So in a climate adaptation forum, I probably don't need to go heavily into the details of the things that we might expect from a physical point of view for climate change in New England, changes in precipitation, rising sea levels, storm surge, ocean acidification, that sort of thing. But as I like to tell my students, I teach environmental economics at the University of Southern Maine. And so someone once said that I am in the most dismal part of the dismal science, which is true. So we can take a lot of those physical impacts of climate change and link them to economic impacts. And I like to tell my students that you cannot separate economics from the environment. The two of them are inextricably combined. You can't have an environmental policy without having economic impacts. You can't have an economic policy without having environmental impacts. So third law of thermodynamics, matter can neither be created nor destroyed, links the whole thing all together. So just want to, I don't want to read this slide, but I just want to point out a few things. So at the same time, increased precipitation, increase in drought conditions. In Maine, we have some sectors in Maine that rely heavily on agriculture and forestry and fishing, and we expect to see some serious economic implications from that. Rising sea levels and storm surge. We've in Maine, again, we had a rude awakening. We had double storms, back-to-back storms last winter that really pummeled the infrastructure, the fishing infrastructure in coastal Maine. In fact, the entire working waterfront in Stonington, Maine, which is one of the primary lobster landings ports in Maine, was washed away. So we're seeing some serious implications of that. Taken all together, loss of tax revenue, loss of employment, and loss of ecosystem services. And I'd be happy to talk about that in more detail later. So Maine in particular issued a report a couple of years ago talking about the cost of doing nothing in Maine. And so again, I don't want to read the slide, but I want to highlight a couple of things here that people may not necessarily think of. The fourth bullet, the loss of blue carbon, so eelgrass and salt marsh, and the ecosystems from that. So in coastal Maine, we're seeing a lot of from storm surge and sea level rise. We're seeing a lot of infiltration of salt water into marshes, and we also are seeing a lot of invasive species. For example, in specifically green crabs, coming up from southern places to seek the colder waters, and those green crabs are having a serious impact on our eelgrass. So eelgrass, as can be a source of blue carbon, can be a source of carbon sequestration, but also serves as a nursery to baby fish and other aquatic species. And so that's a kind of a ripple effect that you might not necessarily expect. The last thing that I want to highlight on this graph and on this slide, and of course I can go back to any points, but I tend to talk a lot, so I'll talk about this later if there's time. But a lot of wastewater treatment plants are located in low-lying areas, and that's for economic reasons, right? It saves on pumping costs to be located in a low-lying area. But those areas are also very vulnerable to climate change, to flooding, and to storm surge. So those are some of the economic implications that we might see. From a municipal point of view, we could see loss in property tax revenue, population decline in certain places, although in Maine, there's been a lot of talk about climate migration, so people moving from more climate change vulnerable areas of the country to Maine because they see it as a safe haven. But also I want to highlight here the disruptions to businesses. 40% of businesses nationally don't reopen after a disaster. And we're seeing a lot of this in Maine because of those storms that I mentioned last year. Some of the restaurants in coastal Maine that were very hard hit are not going to reopen. And especially if you're talking about rural areas might, that restaurant or that business might be the only one of its kind in a very, in a very large area in rural areas. So that's a big thing as well. And Carrie, I don't know, or Jessamine, are we able to send out these slides to the participants later? Okay, because I've got a lot of links in that. Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so talking about resiliency, so here today we're mostly talking about climate resiliency, but as an economist, I would be remiss to not mention economic resiliency. So the kind of the sister of that. So climate resiliency is the ability to anticipate, prepare for, and respond to hazardous events related to climate change, whereas economic resiliency is the ability to anticipate, withstand, and bounce back from any type of shock or stress. And so the two of them are very much related. And so what we want to look for is we want to look for investments that are both climate resilient and economically resilient. So I apologize for not having a pretty picture on this slide. At any rate, so Indrani also already mentioned that FEMA issued a report that said that $1 invested in climate resilience can lead to at least $6 in benefits. That $6 actually only includes the avoided cleanup and repair costs. And so it can be up to, the figures that I looked at said it can be up to $13 if you include some of the economic costs that go beyond that. So the avoided economic costs of lower jobs, labor force participation, reduced population, reduced tax revenue, and missing income. But even on top of that, there are ecosystem benefits that we could invest in, or that we could enhance by investing in climate resilience. So, for example, protection of biodiversity and enhanced carbon sequestration. Those are ecosystem benefits that we can hopefully enhance or take advantage of with some of the investments in climate resiliency. So the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is not usually a cheerleader for climate action, as far as I am aware, wrote that dollars spent on preparedness and resilience are much more effective at reducing the overall cost of disasters than the dollars spent after the fact on recovery. As my grandmother and probably everybody's grandmother used to say, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. It's the same type of thing here. But I also want to focus on kind of the co-benefits of investing in climate resiliency. So we already talked about enhanced ecosystem benefits, but there are also co-benefits such as improved health by reducing air pollution, in addition to reducing greenhouse gases, or the increased attractiveness of downtown areas by tree planting, walkability, that sort of thing. And also talking about reduced urban heat island effects by planting trees, but the trees also can filter out air pollution. So there are some co-benefits there as well that aren't always necessarily top of mind. Excuse me. I practiced my presentation in front of my students yesterday, and someone asked if I was nervous, and I said yes. But thank you. Thank you. Okay, so some of the steps that we might take in, and Jessamine, how am I doing on time? Okay, cool. Thank you. So some of the steps that we might take in planning for economic and climate resiliency is first to anticipate the likely physical changes that will accompany climate change, and some of those things that we already talked about. But the second step, and kind of it doesn't have to be sequential, it can be at the same time, is to establish an economic baseline. So in a municipality, what are the largest employers in that municipality? What are the largest sources of tax revenue? So in Maine, for most municipalities, their largest source of tax revenue is property taxes, and that's probably the same for a lot of municipalities. But what are the municipalities' assets? So economic, physical, and social. And I include social in here as well, talking about places of worship, for example, churches, synagogues, mosques, those sorts of areas, those sorts of places where people congregate are considered to be social assets, as well as physical assets. So then, but also we wanted to take a look at what are the key commuting patterns, key commuting routes into and out of a particular community. What are the supply chain routes that are, because a lot of the business disruptions occur not just because of decreased demand, but because of decreases or disruptions to their supply chains. And so if we have roads, for example, that are going to be affected by increased flooding, how are goods and services going to get into the community? Not to mention the emergency routes. So I was talking with Rachel over here at this table, who is also, thank you, by the way, for being on the steering committee. And she was talking about her work with people with disabilities. And so this is a huge issue in Maine as well. But if we're talking about, especially in rural areas, where some of those routes are very vulnerable to sea level rise or to flooding, a lot of people will end up being stranded, and so there are emergency route issues as well. And so then establish a vulnerability scale. Look at all the assets. Try and figure out how vulnerable they are to climate change, and maybe the magnitude and direction of the effect. Then try and think about, you don't have to put an actual number on it, but try and think about the economic impact on that asset, or the social impact on that asset. And then the next step, to identify projects or procedures designed to address each asset. Indrani and I worked on a project together a number of years ago. It feels like a long time, but it wasn't really that long, but it feels like it was pre-COVID at any rate. And which feels like it. Anyway, shut up, Rachel, keep going. Okay, so so here are some of the metrics that we came up with in that project. So looking at the different types of investments that we could have done. This was a project to enhance stormwater separation, for example. And so these were some of the metrics that we came up with stakeholders to kind of rank each of the possible investments that we could do. And then we had workshops with the community, where the communities kind of the people sort of ranked each of these options, each of the investment options according to these metrics, and also put weights on them as well. And so we were able to come up with a rough sort of list of how we might prioritize those investments. Okay, so I did some work with the Southern Maine Planning and Development Commission, which is a kind of a non-governmental organization in York County, where we worked with GEI consultants to model the impact of sea level rise and storm surge on 6 municipalities in Southern Maine. So GEI did the GIS work, looked at different levels of sea level rise and storm surge in those areas. Then we identified the businesses and the other assets located within the inundation zone, and then we were able to estimate the economic activity and the tax revenue at risk from sea level rise. So we also projected the loss of tourism in the area. So especially in York County, the 6 towns that we looked at, very heavily dependent on beach tourism. And so a lot of the beaches, especially like in York, Maine, the town of York, Maine, are heavily at risk from climate change. Oh, 5 minutes. Okay, cool. I'll talk really fast. Yeah, so we projected a loss of tourism based on those areas as well, and then we appraised social vulnerability as well. So, ethnic and racial diversity. Maine is the whitest state in the country. I'm not entirely proud of that fact, but it is a fact. But social vulnerability here mostly took the form of elderly and disabled, as well as low income. A lot of these towns in southern Maine, low income is not necessarily a big issue, but there are pockets of deep poverty in those areas, and so those are some of the things that we need to look at as well. From that work, so we did kind of the preliminary work there, and then the Southern Maine Planning and Development Commission worked with those towns to come up with a number of different strategies that they could use to strengthen both climate and economic resilience. And so these are some of the things that they came up with, and this is working with the towns directly. So working with the people in the towns. These were not things that consultants came up with. So we provided the kind of the background, the framework of that. And then the towns had a number of workshops, and these were some of the things. And there's a link down below to give more detail. These were some of the things that they came up with. So here are just some resources, and again, if when we distribute this slideshow later, you can look at some of these resources, as well as some of the resources that were in the presentation itself. And there's me. There's my information, and let's batter up for the next presenter. Thank you. Oh, should I take some questions? Okay, I'll take some questions. Yes. Oh, one over there.
Yes, and if you can introduce yourself, please, that'll be great.
Seth Jaffe, Foley Hoag. Thanks for this. It was really interesting. As I looked at your list of metrics, they didn't really seem like metrics. They seemed like things for which you would establish metrics.
That's a good point.
The question is, like, how do you actually measure these things? Things like the social value of religious things, hard to put into economic terms. So how do you actually measure them, and how do you compare them when they're not necessarily the same types of things?
That's a great point, and maybe metrics was kind of the wrong way. I can't think of what a better word would be, but yeah, metrics are usually things that you can measure. So you can measure things both qualitatively and quantitatively, which of course sounds odd, maybe coming from an economist, but as my late father used to say, an economist is someone who can tell you the value of the price of everything and the value of nothing, right? Which was actually Oscar Wilde, but my dad made it his own. At any rate, so I would have to look back at the spreadsheet that we use in Drawing. I mean, we used a number of both qualitative and quantitative measures, but some of those things, I would say that it takes a long time to actually kind of monetize things. And frankly, I'm not sure that it's really all that valuable, but if you talk to take that time, but you can get a good idea of how valuable something is to the community just in qualitative terms as well. So there are a couple of different ways that you can do that. Yeah. Indrani, do you want to add anything to that?
Okay. No, I think you covered it well. I think there were a combination of quantitative and qualitative metrics. And I think the list there was more considerations and criteria. And then for those criteria, there was a full community engagement process as part of that planning process to come up with appropriate metrics and how to score those criteria with those metrics.
Yes. Criteria would be a better word. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for the question.
Yes, I'm going to go over. While we can take the question in here in the room. I saw a hand being raised.
Oh.
Hey there, I'm Emma Gildes-Game from the Nature Conservancy. Hi, Rachel.
Hello.
We worked together years ago on something, but my question is about translating this knowledge of how much value there is in acting proactively and what strategies have worked to convince people to actually make that investment. Because it's like, in my experience and from what I've talked to many others in this room and beyond this room about is, okay, conceptually, yeah, totally. There's a ton of benefit of acting proactively. All of our grandmother's wisdoms about ounces of prevention. But then when it actually comes to putting it in your municipal budget or, getting investment otherwise, there's a lot of stalling. So in all of this work, what have been some successes around actually convincing people to spend the money now rather than later? Please answer all the questions. Solve everything. I know that's a huge question.
Okay, so in some communities they've already drunk the Kool-Aid, right? And they're already on board. Other communities are not, and I think in Maine, for example, there are certain areas in Maine where you can't use the words climate change. You just can't. But if you say, the how have you seen the fishing change over time? Are you able to catch the same number of are you able to dig the same number of clams that you did 10 years ago? Well, no. Are you getting more diverse in species? No. Right. So you need to find a way to make the case in a different language. And what has been helpful to us is if we can find a trusted member of a community who is on board, that goes a lot towards, making those sorts of things work. I mean, I know this is New England based. It's not just Maine, but that's obviously what I know best. There's a real government and real distrust of government and academics, especially from the southern part of the state, and especially transplants from Massachusetts who moved to Maine. There's a real distrust of that. And so you can't go in and say, hey, look, it's going to make a lot of economic sense. The other thing that really worked, I hate to say it, is those storms. Those storms in Maine really, really woke people up and went, oh shit, that's what's coming down the pike. That's what we're going to have to deal with. So I wish I could give you a magic bullet. I can't. But there has been a lot of really good work. There has been a lot, but you have to kind of keep at it. People are people. I could go on, so I'll stop there. But thanks for that question. I hope I kind of answered that. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Thank you.
I think we'll take one more. We see a couple of hands in the room. I have one question in the virtual room, so maybe we'll take that. And so the question is related to Rachel. Thank you for a really interesting presentation. Sorry, lost the new question came in. Could you speak to the cost of modeling climate economic trajectories and how communities decide to invest in that kind of analysis?
Okay, let me read the question again. Thanks. The cost of modeling climate economic trajectories. Okay, so yeah, I think that, the first thing, of course, is to do maybe some GIS analysis. for how climate change is expected to affect a community. So GEI, and I forgot to put a link to, no, I did put a link. The Southern Maine Planning and Development Commission, the study that we did in York County, our report, our Bouvier Consulting's report was mostly on the economic impacts, but the GIS impacts were done by GEI consultants, and what they did is they chose a couple of different levels of sea level rise and storm surge, and they modeled that. But this is in an area where the sea level rise and storm surge was of the primary importance or primary concern for that area. If you're going inland, it might be flooding from rivers. It might be it might be the drought or heat waves or that sort of thing. So you need to find someone who can model those impacts. The economic trajectories. A lot of these studies can actually be pretty expensive, and I'm looking at Indrani as well, because she knows this. A lot of these models can be pretty expensive. However, from a municipal standpoint, I don't actually think it's really necessary to go through all of that. I think you can get some good basic information just by looking at some of the published studies that have been done already. And so I don't think it's really necessary for a cash-strapped municipality to spend a lot of money on a very detailed economic and environmental analysis. I think that you have to work with what you have, and I think that there are a lot of resources out there that can help municipalities do that in a less expensive way. Was I rambling there? I feel like I was rambling. Okay. All right. Good. Okay. Thank you.
Jessamine, do we have time or no? We'll hold the questions. We'll have plenty of time for that, but we'll move on to our next speaker. Thank you, Rachel.
All day. Thank you. I just want to see Big Pappy again. We all want to see Big Pappy again, don't we? All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And yes, as Indrani mentioned, we will have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So write down your question. If you're like me, write down your question or you will forget it by the time we get to the Q&A. Next up, we have a joint presentation from Scott Bosworth and Iram Farouk. And I should have mentioned this before, I'm not reading full bios, but you do have them in your programs if you want to learn more about any of our amazing speakers. But Scott is Transit-Oriented Development and Innovative Delivery for the MBTA. He has worked for 3 decades in the transportation infrastructure and development fields, and he has worked in transportation policy and strategy for, I think I counted right, 4 Massachusetts governors, and was most recently asked to support the Healy Driscoll administration in helping, quote, turn around the MBTA, which I think is probably not a small ask. But we wish you luck on that. And I'll just quickly introduce Aram as well, because he will be joined by Aram, who is Assistant City Manager for Community Development for the City of Cambridge. She is a self-proclaimed urban optimist, which is not always easy to maintain, and I love that. Focused on integrated solutions for livable, sustainable, just, and resilient communities. And I'm just going to share a personal note. Once upon a time, a young, recent grad in 2008 started working for the City of Cambridge and met Iran. That was one of the first people I met, and she was so kind and so smart, and I was very impressed with her, and I think you'll all be impressed with her today as well. So thank you, Aram and Scott. Take it away.
Thank you, Carrie. Thank you so much. And thank you, Rachel, for your presentation. I'm so glad to be here, and I'm flattered for the invitation. I'm so sorry he had to leave. Jeff Mullen was the one who instigated my involvement here, and I just want the crowd to know how important Jeff is to Massachusetts transportation. He is incredible. I'd be lost without him. But so I am thrilled to be here. representing the MBTA and MassDOT. I've recently been asked to be the Chief Development Officer of both, and it's pretty much the same role, but just both agencies, which I did before. So I'm going to run through quickly a few things here. Ooh, wow, that's fast. And I'm so happy to be sharing the podium today with Aram, who's been a long-term partner of ours at MassDOT and MBTA. We've done projects right from the Boston border right to Belmont. We're working on a very great project right now. We'll be talking about shortly. But I'm going to run through a few things. I really want you to understand how we at MassDOT and MBTA, particularly MBTA right now, are rethinking the way we do business with partners. If we're going to meet our goals, we've got to partner with government and the private sector and other stakeholders. So I want to point out the MBTA climate adaptation and resiliency efforts that are underway here. I'm not going to speak to this climate assessment because I can't. I'm not qualified. However, I just want you to know our colleagues at the MBTA are doing a phenomenal job analyzing the needs, the threats, the needs, and then my job is to hopefully find ways to partner to meet those needs. I do want to give 1 second of just the MBTA is so important to all of us, whether you ride it or not. It is a critical asset of the Commonwealth and our resiliency goals. I want you guys to know I've been around a long time. My first involvement with the MBTA started in 1988 when I worked on Capitol Hill in Washington, and I've been around kind of a long time. I can tell you there has never been a better culture than right now. Phil Ang, the governor brought in Phil Ang. He has assembled a great team, and they're doing amazing things. I feel so proud every day to be there, and I just want you to know that we're on the right track. A year ago, we were at rock bottom. I'm telling you, maybe a little over a year ago. But so I just feel important to know that we should all feel really good about where we're going. We're able to, do a lot of different things at once. So I'm going to quickly tell you about my group. I run a few different groups, but we have a transit-oriented development group that has. It's actually run by Jennifer Mecca. Some of you may know she's an architect and does a phenomenal job. Jen had, over the last few years, has assembled a great group of architects, engineers, planners, and construction managers, and they do an amazing job. I don't think people have an understanding of how many projects that we at the MBTA, TOD type projects, are overseeing. You can see the numbers there on, in their different categories. I won't go into too much detail, but there are, this group has been primarily I'll use the word defensive group. As people come to us and developing near our assets, this group has kind of overseen, made sure they did it in a way that's safe and met our regulations and requirements. We're changing the mission of that group to be more proactive, to work with those individuals, those developers, those proponents to say, okay, you're doing this, but we also need your help. Okay, you building a wall there is going to create, a support wall there is going to create us problems over here. You've got to fund that. So we're really changing the role of the group. And at the same time, we're also looking at our properties and preparing our properties for transit-oriented development to create places to live, work, and play. And Aram and I will talk a little bit more about our signature project at Alewife coming up. So we're really proud of what we're doing. We've got a long way to go, but this is changing the relationship with our stakeholders. We have projects all over. You all know where the MBTA. We have 171 towns, whatever, in our network. And we're open to business in any one of them. And I'm sure you've seen many of our projects. The one at South Station, obviously, and our air rights projects are moving forward. But we are now looking at others. We mentioned Alewife, but JFK, UMass. All over the network. I won't go into all of them, but we're looking at every opportunity we can to partner with folks. But this is really the key to it all. We recognize that we're a transit agency. We're not a development agency, and we have lots of needs. We want to partner with the folks like yourselves and the developing community to help us meet those needs. So we're looking at joint development opportunities where we're early in the process, partnering with developers, communities, stakeholders to try and find out ways to create opportunities to build transit-oriented development and meet all of our capital needs. You all know our state of good repair backlog is so huge. And if we're going to meet it, we're going to have to find ways to partner. And every one of these projects have in our view, have great environmental and resiliency benefits. Obviously, if you create a housing complex at Alewife, you're getting people out of their cars where they can live and jump right on the red line. So, but we're looking, at also at public-private partnerships. We think that's really important, and particularly in the vertical market, there's great opportunities to get private investment to help us to move things forward, move projects forward. We can't do it on our own. We just can't. And so we need to, find ways to be more innovative. We'll get more into this one. I think it's really important for folks here to know that the traditional way for government in particular to partner with the private sector is it's not efficient. It doesn't work. We spend millions and millions of dollars and years of pre-development work trying to come up with a request for proposals where everyone is bidding on an apples to apples, format. I get that, makes sense. However, when you do that and you're saying, hey, give us your price, you get locked in. I won't mention the project, but we did one of those recently, a few years back, and a bid came in at just a little bit under $100 million. That project today is worth about 30, but because of the law, we're stuck at 100, and we have to get $100 million because that's the way the bid went, and so we're stuck. So on Alewife, we're looking at a different way. Alewife and others, but Alewife's our first big one. We're looking to bring a development partner in based on qualifications, and work with that partner, and work with that partner to say, here are our goals. We have a deteriorating garage. We have serious transportation issues in this area. We have water issues. We have flooding issues and combined sewer overflow issues here. Together, we can walk the path of coming up with a development. By the way, I should say that in the case of Alewife, our first call when we decided to do this was to Ram, and decided that we need to do this with the community. We need to plan and bring someone on that can join us in a public-private partnership to develop some sort of an asset here that can help us fund our needs. And our needs here obviously is we have a failing garage. We have to rebuild it, but also we can create a new place there. If you folks are familiar with Alewife in particular, it's not an inviting place. It really isn't. When I say Alewife, I mean our assets at Alewife. It's obviously a very inviting place. Sorry about that. It's a behemoth of a garage that just is. It's not. We want to work with Cambridge and come up, and our partners and the stakeholders on the ground, and obviously the environmental community, to come up with something there that we can all agree upon. Now, is that going to get us the highest possible dollar amount? Probably not. But then we, as the MBTA, the Healy administration, it's not all about money. It's about creating value in different ways, and that's what we're trying to do. I'm going to move on here because we'll talk more about Alewife, I'm sure. I just want to mention a few other things that we're doing that are really important. You're all probably familiar with the National Environmental, Electric Vehicle Initiative, but you may not be so much involved, up to speed on our service plazas. We have 18 service plazas, and we have hundreds of park and ride facilities. You may have read in the paper recently that we're out to bid to bring in a new partner. To run and revitalize our service plazas. What's key there is that we are the top of the agenda. There is electric vehicle charging. We need to create a very robust network with our highways in order to, for trucks and personal vehicles to charge. And so we're going to, it's a major opportunity for us to partner with the private sector to say, here's the site. Tell us how you can, create 10, 20, 15 charging facilities. You're all familiar with Woodette Circle and Cabot Yard, which is, just not far from here. These are assets of ours that are very vulnerable, extremely vulnerable right now to flooding and to climate change. And we're very concerned about it. One of them, obviously, Cabot is our number one yard in all of the network that we have. And we already have flooding issues there. In Woodette Circle, we bought about a year and a half ago, which will soon become a storage and maintenance area for us. We are working with the federal government on a federal loan under the Railroad Infrastructure Finance Program to help us fund the resiliency. We're going to have to bring that property up at the same time making sure that when we bring it up, we're not causing problems in other places, which is really critical. That program is fantastic. It's a very low interest and very positive loan program that's not only available to us, by the way, it's also available to private developers to do projects as well. And I just want to mention every project we work with our private development partners, we're looking at ways to meet our environmental goals. I mean, I'm going to reference Suffolk Downs and Beachmont. HYM Investments has a massive project out there. We're working very closely with them to understand the water flow in that area. Our stations along the Blue Line are very vulnerable. And so we're working on a whole berming process, project that they would help us fund. It actually is more beneficial to us than it is to them, but we said, hey, you want our support? We're going to need your support. So helping there as well. And then we are moving to a all electric bus fleet, which is very, very important. We're committed to it. The governor has held us to a timeline. And so we have to build 6 more battery electric bus facilities. We have one underway right now in Quincy. It's massive. It's beautiful. And hopefully you all have seen it. And it's a great thing. But we funded that out of our capital program. We have no funding for the other 6. None at this point. We have to find creative ways to partner with folks in a P3 model in order to, in order to help us fund these. And we're going to have to reach into our capital plan to do it, but we can certainly defray those costs by some private sector, involvement. So let's see. I guess that's it for me for now. I'm looking forward to questions. I hopefully can address them, but I want to bring up Aram. And as I said, I can't tell you how great our relationship is with the city of Cambridge, from Kendall all the way to Alewife. We're thrilled to be working with you and your team.
Thank you, Scott. Are you guys familiar with Bocce chocolates? They look like this. So this is, I think it's Italy's version of Hershey's Kisses, but it's much better. It's dark chocolate, hazelnut. The reason I'm bringing it up is not because I'm addicted to chocolate, but because they come with these little things in them that are like fortune cookie, but they're quotes. And some time ago, I got this one, and it had a quote ostensibly by Thomas Jefferson, and it goes like this. It says, if you want something that you have never had, you must be willing to do something that you have never done. I've since discovered that this is a completely false attribution. Jefferson did not say this, but the words have stayed with me as a reminder that when we think about solving the problems of the future, we cannot be looking just to the solutions of the past, and we need to be in order to solve the unprecedented problems, we are going to have to come up with new solutions and new ways of working. So I'd like to zoom out just a little bit, and then I'll come back to what Scott was talking about. When we think globally, the estimate is that by 2050, about 70% of all of humanity will be living in cities. So when Carrie says I'm an urban optimist, I feel like the reason for that is that all of the solutions that we have to come up with are going to be, the solutions will be in cities, especially solutions that are going to help people who are most vulnerable. And so the investments that we need to make today in cities in order to be ready and in order to make sure that the people in the future are going to be able to have basic services, that they'll have good jobs, and that they will be able to live lives that are comfortable and dignified, are things that we have to solve for right now. I want to say that this is something that when we started working on climate change resilience and really thinking about our vulnerability in the future, I know many of you probably know John Bolduc. I have to mention him because he's been such a driving force. He's since retired, but and is working now with Indrani. So I'm sure you all will see him, but he really deserves a lot of the credit here. And I've lost my train of thought as I talked about John and how wonderful he is. But what I wanted to say is that we started to look at our vulnerabilities here in the city of Cambridge, well, across the river in the city of Cambridge. And like many of the cities and towns up and down the coast, like Rachel was talking about, the vulnerabilities are largely related to storm surge, sea level rise, precipitation, so flooding, and heat, increased heat. And we're trying now, since then, that was back in 2017-ish, we completed that report. And now, thank you, we're doing our resilience work, which we completed a plan in 22 and have been trying to figure out how best to implement that. So I'll go back to partnership, and cities can't do this alone, even though the solutions are here. So there are things that we can put into our operating budgets and our capital budgets. So as we work to improve our the resilience of our infrastructure to flooding. So we have combined sewers. Like our city was built in the 1600s, and many of the infrastructure date back to that time. But so some of that, we put in a lot of capital investment into planting trees. It's stuff that cities can do. But there are a lot of things that cities cannot do, and they certainly can't do alone. And we have been lucky to have that we have an incredibly supportive state government, and even in past administrations have had supportive state governments, and the MVP grants, the municipal vulnerability and preparedness grants have been incredibly helpful for us, but also regional partnerships. So the Resilient Mystic Collaborative and the coalition around the Charles River. But I'm going to shout out Julie Wormser, who in her prior role, we have since scooped her to the city of Cambridge, was at the Mystic River Watershed Association and led the Resilient Mystic Collaborative, which convened 21 cities and collectively looking at our 2070 vulnerabilities to the one-year coastal storm, helped figure out all of the key interventions. So there's like 9 key interventions. If we were to implement those, they would keep 12 communities safe, which would impact over 100,000 residents and over $60 billion of real estate value. That group has been actively lobbying for federal support. And I would say our federal delegation has been incredibly supportive and have gotten millions of dollars to help with that implementation. So again, I feel like a broken record when I talk about partnership, but Scott touched on this as well, that ultimately there's the partnership with other cities and towns, but there's the partnership between city and state, but also the partnership with private sector is incredibly important. And that brings us full circle to Alewife. So Alewife is the part of Cambridge that is most vulnerable to climate change impacts, both from flooding and heat. You weren't wrong, Scott, when you said it's not a great place. It's very different from the rest of Cambridge, but it is. It's old industrial, it's 60s office buildings that have been transforming, but it is surrounded by this incredible richness of natural resources, active parks, the only urban wild in the metro region, in the inner core. It has rich transit. It's right on the Red Line. the commuter rail line runs through it doesn't stop, Scott. We need to work on that. But it's also right next to the largest concentration of poverty in the city. So we have a significant amount of affordable housing there. And one of our nonprofit partners, Just a Start, has just created a new economic mobility hub to help job training right adjacent to all of that housing, which is fantastic. But there is, in an area like that, that is generally paved over, the only way to create better outcomes is to redevelop. And so we're super excited about the project that Scott has mentioned, which is early enough that we're not talking in specifics, but next time you have Scott here, he'll probably have much more to add. From the city side, I would say the things that are super important to us are enhancing that connectivity, making sure we bring in a lot of housing, including and especially more affordable housing, and also that transformation creates real resilience benefits. And from the city side, what we have put in place there, as well as citywide, is that in 2023, we created requirement for resilience zoning, so that actually creates requirements for people to build to the 2070 flood elevations, and also created with that a green factor. We were sort of forced to call it a green factor, but okay. I'm told to wrap up. We wanted to call it a cool factor because, you know, resilience is cool, but it impacts heat. So I have to wrap up now, but what I want to say is that will be foundational to the work that we do together. And we are hoping that as the MBTA brings in a private partner, that will be the start of work that we do together with the community to come up with a plan that makes a great place that is long-term resilient to climate change impacts. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you. So Aram has to leave, so she will not be available to take questions during the panel. So we are going to take a couple of questions with her now. And Indrani, just so you know, there is a virtual question if you would like to take that.
All right, we're giving our virtual attendees a bit of a preference for this one first. So I'm stating the question here. My understanding is that Massachusetts has some legislation that supports PPP in transit. Can you talk a bit about the policies that support doing PPPs, the public-private partnerships, and how it may be expanded beyond transit? Also curious about how to ensure community benefits are robust within a PPP.
I think this works. I'll address it quick. So yes, Massachusetts does have a public-private partnership law in place. It was written a while ago. It needs to be updated, but it is pretty good. It does allow us, to enter in P3s in certain circumstances. We're looking to change that. We've offered legislation in the last few years to give us a little bit more flexibility. Right now, unfortunately for the MBTA, we don't have as much flexibility as MassDOT does. So we think that's really important to be able to, for instance, we cannot have a designer and our contractor on the same team. It's just not allowed. So we're looking to change that. Here at Alewife, which is truly a P3, is a little different because it's at the end of the day, we will be entering into a lease with our partner. It's a nuance in the law, but it is an important nuance that allows us to move forward. Certainly on our NEVI stuff, and the service plazas, again, that it borders on a true P3, design, build, finance, operate, maintain. But it's different that it's a lease. So we need to make that more flexible. The governor has been very supportive. Legislature has almost passed the legislation that would tweak it, but we're not quite there yet. At the same time, we're using the laws and the rules we have to be as creative as we possibly can. And I don't know, Ram, the second part of the question was more about municipalities.
Sure. Yeah. So I think it's our job as the city to make sure that the public benefits are incorporated into the project. So one of the things that the T has been great about in this project is creating that partnership really early with the city, as Scott mentioned. And so once the development partner is selected, they will be part of a community process that we will engage in. Right now, there is virtually no entitlement for development on that site. And so in creating that entitlement, we will really be able to have an opportunity to really also come up with what are then the benefits that make sense for the community. And then foundationally, there's also, as I mentioned, the resilience zoning. So there are a whole bunch of citywide regulations. We have inclusionary housing requirements. We have incentive zoning payments which also go to affordable housing. So there are certain things that are just baseline in Cambridge that any project would abide by, but then those are more like the stick pieces of the regulation, and then the carrots are things that we would create as we work together to figure out, in exchange for additional development, what might be the things that the community most needs that could be satisfied through the project.
That's great. Thank you. We'll take a few questions from the room here. Yes, Emily. Sorry, Jessamyn's coming over with the microphone. If you can introduce yourself, please.
Yes, thank you so much. My name is Emily Norton. I'm the Executive Director of the Charles River Watershed Association. Thank you so much for being here. Great presentation. I have two things. First, Woodette Circle. We've done a lot of analysis of that area. Scott and I have discussed, very vulnerable to flooding. Thank you so much for referencing that. When I read in the newspaper that we're looking at that as a layover space for trains, seems like a bad idea. But my question for you all, I'm having trouble understanding. So it sounds like there's an old way of doing things, and this is a better way of doing things with Alewife and in the future in other communities. If you're a resident of Cambridge, like how is your life different because of this new, better way of doing it? Or if you're a city councilor in Cambridge or whatever, are we going to overall save money? Is there going to be a better outcome in some way? And maybe you're not far enough along to be able to really spell that out, but I'm curious, like, what did the world look like before? What does the world look like now? Because in my community of Newton, with my sort of resident hat on, there's an announcement about a new commuter rail stop, which is awesome. But now I'm like, wait a minute, is there something we should be doing better with the MBTA that we're not? So I just, if you could, like, the more specific you could be about how people will experience this new, better way of doing things.
Is it working? Thank you, Emily. Thanks for all the work you do, by the way. And if we don't have Woodette, we can't give you more service. So just quickly on that, I just want to mention, in Alewife, in the model, the joint development model that we're doing, let me go back. I talked about the traditional method. That is, in my view, an arrogant way for the state to say what we're going to do in a community. That we go out and get bids and we get beautiful, plans and buildings and everything. Then we go to the city and say, look what we got. And it disregards the needs of the community. This way, we're not asking for that. We're not at Alewife, we're not asking for designs. We don't want to know. We don't even want, if you want to tell us what you think might work here, that's fine. But we're not asking you to say what you're going to build, because we're going to do that together, all of us. And we'll make those decisions, the decisions on our, what's the priorities are for us. And as I said, obviously for the MBTA, capital and funds are very, very important, but they're not. This governor has stressed to us it's not the most important thing. We need to be respectful of our host communities. We need, the governor said we want as much affordable housing as we can, mixed housing as we can. We want to address our environmental needs, and as a result, the governor has said we'll find you money to make up for shortfalls. But we think the collaborative method of working together will bring projects faster, because we're not at odds. We're not trying to dictate what's going to happen. We're doing it together. And again, I'll stress that by bringing a development partner in early, we're admitting that we're not developers and we shouldn't be. We should rely on really experienced developing teams that we can create chemistry with our host communities.
That's great. Question, Rachel.
Thank you so much for this enlightenment. My name is Rachel, and I am a research student in the school for UMass Boston, and I'm also part of the Climate Steering Committee. So my question is directed towards the pre-development agreement you talked about early on. I know you touched it briefly, but I would like to know, you mentioned working with public and private strengths to attract private investments. So does this process include maybe ad hoc committee or expert professionals that gather together to talk about solutions around transportation, resilient zoning, or mixed income housing? Are these inputs, like, are there committee members that can come together through this process to ensure that, you know, conversations like this are getting on early and beyond? That's what I want to know.
I appreciate the question. I think that's exactly what we're hoping for, right? And I'll reference another project, Dorchester Bay City, down in the UMass Boston area, where we are part of a very comprehensive team looking at all. I mean, obviously, it's an area that's very vulnerable, to flooding and climate change. Morrissey Boulevard, which runs right through the heart of there, and that needs to be raised up to 7 feet. I mean, those are the things. So we are working, we bring together the experts, and again, acknowledging what we're good at, what we're not, and bringing in the community and other experts like Emily's group to help guide us and advise us and make the right decisions as we go forward. Every project's different, and every project brings together different teams, and I think that's really important. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
I think in the interest of time, we're going to move forward. Iram, we are, unfortunately, I know you'll have to leave, but if you can stick around for a little bit during the break so people can get to questions that they may have wanted to ask you, and then we'll have Scott for the full panel. But thank you all. We'll take a short break and we'll be back in just a minute 5 or...
Actually, before we take a break, we have some fun announcements. So Anna's going to come up and introduce...
Extremely sorry.
Oh, no, you're good. Rebecca Hurst.
I'm going to take a brief moment of your time to introduce Rebecca Hurst. So she is the Associate Director for Resilience at the Boston Green Ribbon Commission, and she supports the strategic alignment across the Green Ribbon Commission's 6 working groups and the Climate Justice Initiative, among many other things. But she's also the previous director of the Sustainable Solutions Lab, and she's part of the founders of the forum that you're at today. And she just has a couple minutes of time to share with you some Green Ribbon Commission work.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Anne. Yeah, I'm a proud co-founder of the CAF, so it's so fun to be here. So today, I just wanted to share a little bit about coastal resilience financing in Boston and efforts that the Green Ribbon Commission is going to be leading in 2025 in partnership with the city and with our members and with our Coastal Resilience Working Group, which is led by Boston Harbor Now, who I think is online right now. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Green Ribbon Commission, we were formed about 15 years ago to support the city of Boston in accelerating their climate action goals. And since then, we've worked with the city on a number of different projects to understand neighborhood planning level, neighborhood level climate risks, flood pathways, infrastructure needed to mitigate vulnerabilities. We are really instrumental in the Climate Ready Boston work. And many of you know this, but many people broadly don't. Thanks to the Climate Ready Boston work and the subsequent neighborhood plans, Boston is actually one of the few cities in the country that has climate resilience plans for the entire coastline. So each of the 5 neighborhood plans included rough estimates of the cost of doing these different, implementing different investments and resilience efforts along the waterfront. So that gave us an early idea of how much funding and financing would be necessary over the next several decades. So we know more or less what we need to pay for. Subsequent planning studies have provided more specificity. For example, the Wharf District Council, Mark is here from the Wharf District Council, last year developed and released a waterfront plan for Fort Point Channel up to Columbus Park that projected costs that were considerably higher than what the initial Climate Ready Boston estimates were. This year, the Green Ribbon Commission was thrilled to see Mayor Wu create a new Office of Climate Resilience, which is led by the talented and fearless Chris Osgood. So getting to this point where we have the plans and the people has been a huge effort by government, climate scientists, private developers, and engaged nonprofits and residents. And now figuring out how we're actually going to pay for it is the next frontier. So overall, we at the Green Ribbon Commission estimate that the full Boston shoreline protection and cost will cost somewhere between $4 and $10 billion. Many of you know our senior advisor, Bud Riss. He's been keeping tally of all the different plans and figuring out where things add up. And so far, only a handful of projects, primarily ones owned by the city, different parks and some major new private developments have happened so far. So there's a lot that is left to do. So building on all of these planning efforts, the Green Ribbon Commission has a priority project over the next year to wrap our arms around how to finance coastal resilience projects in Boston. We're trying to look at both the funding and also governance that will make those investments possible. So it's such a pleasure to be here today and listen to all of these experts. And I really look forward to working with many of you in the coming year as we tackle this tough but not insurmountable challenge together. Thanks a lot.
Awesome. Sorry. I have the pleasure of taking you all into the break. So we're going to take a break and we are going to just extend that time a little bit. We'll come back at 11:10 and start up with our next presentation. So ignore 11:05. You get 5 extra minutes. Please go out, enjoy, meet people. Don't forget to say hello to people at your table if you haven't met them before. Make those connections if you can. And we'll get back to work at 11:10.
Thank you. Yes, we have to thank Sean extra because he did drive down from icy, snowy Vermont this morning. So thank you for making the trek. Sean O'Rourke is Managing Director of Climate Finance for Quantified Ventures. He's a wide range of background, but brings 15 years of climate leadership in public, nonprofit, private, and academic sectors. He's worked at the Trust for Public Land and taught classes at Boston Architectural College. I took one class there. It was very hard, but I learned a lot. He was also appointed by Governor Gina Raimondo and was to be Rhode Island's first Chief Resilience Officer and was Managing Director at the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank. This is just a snapshot of his many amazing backgrounds. But yeah, take it away, Sean.
Well, thank you, Carrie. And it's absolutely tremendous to be back here in Boston at a climate adaptation forum and EBC event. And you all thought you could get rid of me from not lurking at all of these events over the years by going to Vermont, but I'm back. And also looking at the agenda, it is a thrilling spot to be in when you're between Rebecca Hurst and Joyce Coffey. Like that's like a you made it on the LinkedIn like banner. It's like that's what's going in right up above this. So I'm thrilled to be here. Terrific event. I've always like really kind of valued these events and the different speakers that have been brought in over the years. So what I'm going to try and do today is I'm going to try and push the fringes of what I think this room typically thinks about with climate resilience. Talk about stuff outside of Boston, outside of New England, little dabbling in the conservation finance space to start to bring in some lessons learned, some mechanisms, some approaches that are getting at some of the challenges that we're hearing about today and that all of you are facing sort of as practitioners in this space. The 3 projects that I'm going to focus on, one is about de-risking perceived financial risk of climate resilience, stormwater, green infrastructure projects. I'm also going to talk about a project where we tried to develop a sustainable revenue source and we're actively trying to develop a sustainable revenue source to funding, financing, maintenance operations out west in Arizona. And then finally come back to a example of a project in Texas, which is looking at accessing quick capital for land acquisition. And we used a really interesting approach to accessing revenue to be actual pay back a bridge loan or access to capital for financing. So all wildly different projects from different places in the country, but I think there's nuggets in there that could go to some of the challenges that we all face every day in trying to drive more sustainable, resilient urban systems. So with that, what the heck is Quantified Ventures? Quantified Ventures, we are a funding and financing advisory consulting firm. We work nationally. We have 2 offices, one in Washington, D.C., and as of a few months ago, now in Montpelier, Vermont. No self-serving at all, but we're thrilled to have a growing team in New England, and we work nationally. We work with pioneering organizations, communities, federal agencies to drive investment and capital to climate positive projects. So our role is to see how finance and funding can really accelerate access to getting projects in the ground so that communities can start to realize the benefits better, faster, and cheaper. We work across a whole range of sectors. We have 2 arms of our company. We have a health and human services team, which does a lot of work on the healthcare side, working with Medicare and Medicaid to drive better social outcomes for health. And the work that I lead is on our climate finance team, which is all of the things that you see up here. And we come out there through a variety of different approaches to access the benefits and multiple outcomes that we all care about. How we work, there's a lot of words on this slide. The one thing you can walk away with, all of the work that I try and push and our team pushes, is how can we slide and accelerate the discussion and process towards funding and financing as early in the project origination arc as possible. And this is something that I really learned at the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank, was like this we heard about traditional models and procurement models, was like design, bid, build. Along there's like a step in the way. It's like, okay, well, we've got our 30% design, and now we better go out and find out where that money is going to come from. And the whole thing just keeps slowing down. And so a lot of the work we do is financing is design. Financing is part of the project origination. It is concept design. Our work is coming in alongside project proponents and designers and engineers to see how financing can be a part of the package from the very beginning, so we can start to assemble that all-important capital stack. And there's no one silver bullet for how this weird, wonky stuff that we're all trying to build gets funded and financed. It's always going to be a multitude of sources, and finding out that early is going to make sure the project gets accelerated from the very beginning. We work all across the country, and as I mentioned, a lot of our work is water-based. A lot of us have grown up in the state revolving loan fund world. We've taken a lot of that work from federal agencies, really clunky but fairly foundational programs, and have now applied it to more financial innovation around the country from east to west. You can see we haven't done as much in the middle of the country, but we're looking to fill in this map over the next few years. So this sort of transition to like where I want to go with this quick talk today is this idea of always driving towards outcomes. Been struck over the past number of years with more available funding for climate resilience, climate mitigation work from the federal government. If you look at grants.gov and you like type in your search term, say you want to do stream bank restoration, you might type in like stream bank restoration, maybe a couple grants will pop up. The idea that we really need to strive towards is how do we start to translate not just to the thing you want to build, but what is the outcomes that you want to drive. And if you type in then enhanced biodiversity, water quality, the list starts to grow and grow and grow. And so like my message here today is to start thinking about not just what the thing that's going to be in the ground, what are you going to pay for, but what are the outcomes you're driving towards. And that it really accelerates the potential opportunities for how that thing gets built. Because everyone in that community, all the stakeholders are going to have different perspectives about what that investment means to them. And so figuring out how do you translate the approach, the thing, to the outcomes will start to diversify the potential opportunities. And this is a lot of the work that we do on every single project, is that we're driving towards outcomes. And then we assemble capital stack as a result. And the grants.gov example is one just of many about finding ways to accelerate that work. So a couple of projects, 3 projects that I mentioned, and I'll wrap up with a pretty cool initiative, what I think is a pretty cool initiative that we're driving towards, that's sort of taking up a lot of my life these days. But the first one is an environmental impact bond in Washington, D.C. This is about 7-8 years ago. Some of you may have heard about this transaction. It was the first environmental impact bond in the country. Quantified Ventures' role in this was to really be the quarterback of working with the project proponent, DC Water, working with the outcomes that needed to be achieved through regulatory compliance. DC Water had a EPA consent decree put on them in 2005. They were like, we're going to build a big tunnel. I mean, this is probably a story that maybe many of you have heard around these area of Boston, Providence, big tunnels. No judgment, just big tunnels underground, that function to serve a single purpose, right? Hold water until it can be slowly let out for water quality benefit. What if we started to think about green infrastructure? I would imagine this is a room probably full of green infrastructure proponents for all of the obvious multiple benefit potential. But almost 10 years ago, the idea of green infrastructure in lieu of gray infrastructure to solve regulatory compliance was a bit risky. But DC Water decided, and it's actually our previous CEO, this idea was born at a cocktail party on the back of a napkin with the CFO for DC Water. And he was like, maybe there's another way. And so Quantified Ventures started to quarterback this deal to say, hey, why don't we move the risk, this is that de-risking part, off of DC Water, who's like, you could do the easy thing, build the tunnel, financing it through municipal bonds, pretty safe bet. But again, no one's going to be able to see it. Great disruption to the city, maybe to have one singular benefit, water quality. What if we brought that to capturing water where it falls, green infrastructure on the streets, multiple benefits, urban heat island reduction, all the things that we've talked about? They're like, how do we know if it's going to work? And we're like, there's enough research out there to prove that this thing would work. And so the deal that we structured with DC Water was, can we bring in non-traditional payers, investors, to actually take the risk, move it off of DC Water? So DC Water is like, you know what? If this thing doesn't work, we've got a little bit of a backstop because some investors are willing to take less than a market return. And so the deal we struck was Calvert Foundation, Goldman Sachs said, we'll come in, we'll take a market rate return if this thing functions in a 95% interval. If it underperforms, it's on us. Like DC Water can say, see, it's on the investor side, and then no harm, no foul. If it overperforms, there was an increased payment to the investor. So the incentive, and so it was 95 and then 2.5% on the low end, 2.5% on the high end. And that model allowed for this infrastructure to get built. The other cool thing was that we actually had to monitor how well the performance was of the green infrastructure. And it performed towards the upper end of that 95% confidence interval. It also encouraged DC Water to develop a training and maintenance program where over 100 local entities and actually signed up to actually be maintenance providers for the green infrastructure and actually do the monitoring and evaluation and maintenance alongside. So is this way of kind of trying to think differently about how infrastructure is paid for, procured, how do you share risk to actually try something out to get outcomes that are better than what have been achieved by just doing the business as usual. So this is a really foundational transaction. We've done a similar one in Buffalo, New York, and also in Atlanta, very similar with green infrastructure with a driver of regulatory compliance. Now we're going to go out west, very different area, very different issue, southeastern Arizona. This gets to this idea of, great, we can pay for infrastructure, but how the heck do we maintain it? Where does that money come from? Annual budgeting processes are slow. Like, what if there's a new priority next year? What if there's a new administration? How do we actually ensure that this stuff works and is maintained and monitored over time? And so we've been doing, at QV, we've been doing quite a bit of work with the Department of Defense, an entity that I never thought I would be like working very closely with, but now I do, through a US Army project called Sentinel Landscapes. The Sentinel Landscape Program, I think there's 16 Sentinel Landscapes around the country now. The Sentinel Landscape Program is a fascinating model of using conservation as a way to mitigate conflict between communities and a military installation. You think about military installations, they've got big trucks, they've got bombing ranges, and they've got testing new equipment. They don't necessarily want new condo developments right outside the wall. So they've thought about conservation as a way to get to reduction in conflict. And so this has been a really cool model of working with local conservation organizations such as the Nature Conservancy, Freshwater Trust, and many others out west to see how we can drive more dollars for conservation initiatives that the priority communities and counties are trying to drive. But one of the challenges was in southeastern Arizona at Fort Huachuca, they're like, we're able to get $1 million a year by running around and shaking the couch cushions to monitor our groundwater recharge projects year over year. We don't think that that is a sustainable approach. There's more money now currently in the federal government flowing than there ever has been or ever will be. Is there a way we might be able to accelerate an upfront investment to develop a long-term stewardship endowment that would actually roll off sustainable revenues every single year? And so QV's role in this was to identify the problem of like running around multiple people for years on end to just get to the $1 million they would need. Also, the more that they build, the more that it's going to cost. So we modeled this out over a 50-year period and came up with a number of different scenarios. And the one that we came up with was about an $80 million upfront investment would save the city of Sierra Vista and surrounding communities over $132 million over a 50-year period. Now, the question is like, how do we capitalize $80 million? And so we have a large request into the Department of Defense right now, and that's trending really positively. We've got some regulatory compliance money from southeastern Arizona that corporations are looking to put in. We've got some other foundation money. And so that capital stack here in this example is the capitalization for the endowment up front that would roll off annual returns year over year at over $1 million a clip in order to be able to do this money so that people can then focus on the work and not trying to raise the money year over year. And so this has been a really interesting model that I think could start to be applied in other urban and community settings of initial investment upfront to be for future benefit and allow us to continue to build a little bit smarter. And now the third example, and I just like love this story. Again, it's conservation related, but it's a really cool revenue source that highlights a critical challenge that's been identified. So we've been working with the Katy Prairie Conservancy in the Houston area of Texas, one of the fastest growing counties and cities in the country. Land is being gobbled up by development. There is a high focus right now on conservation by many of the local organizations, but land, as many places in the country, is becoming more scarce for conservation, more fragmented, as well as more expensive. And so how do conservation organizations actually get money in their pockets to be able to move quickly when something comes up? There is a bridge loan opportunity and bridge financing. We did this a lot at the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank. We came up with a number of interesting models for how to actually deploy capital quickly to front reimbursement grants, which is a major challenge of many nonprofit organizations. Like we get the grant for $3 million. Like, well, where does the money come from to pay the contractors to then say it did the work to get repaid? So we did a lot of this like upfront bridge loan financing at the Infrastructure Bank. And we took a similar model here of working with the Katy Prairie Conservancy, trying to develop where the financing could come from. We've been shopping this around to multiple investors. And we said, but how would they actually pay this loan back? And after a lot of workshopping, the cool idea that emerged was, let's sell green burial plots in this conservation area as the source of revenue repayment. And so we've been working with them to develop a constellation of partners that would acquire the land, set up a subsidiary organization, an entity, in order to then be the home for actually running the business side of the green burial plot sales. The land would get restored, revenue would come in, and investors would be repaid. What's been pretty cool about this idea is that many of the community members were absolutely supportive of this idea. And there's been a couple of other models, especially in the land trust community, where green burials is actually starting to become one of the more sustainable revenue source for this type of work. But I mentioned this one, again, very different model than some of the stuff we're dealing here in New England. But it's an interesting way of thinking about all the potential ways that we could pay for infrastructure and conservation just by having conversations and workshopping this from the very beginning. And then finally, one idea and initiative that I am leaning into and our team is leaning into tremendously right now is the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. This is part of the Inflation Reduction Act, $27 billion. This capitalized 3 national green banks around the country. If you read the NOFO, and as it was originally presented from EPA, it had no mention of water. It had no mention of water, it had no mention of climate adaptation, no mention of resilience. It was all like transportation, housing, solar on roofs, EV charging. And we did a ton of advocacy with many champions around the country. And at like 5 o'clock towards the end of the NOFO period, they changed to include it was climate change or critical water infrastructure was added to the NOFO with like no fanfare. And like that was the crack in the door we needed, right? To say everyone's been driving towards natural climate solutions, climate resilience, and needing a sustainable source of capital at this scale with a B for a generation. Now's our moment. And while it wasn't necessarily apparent at the very beginning at first reading that this is what it could go towards, we've been trying really hard. But the question was, and this is a common thing that we hear all along, not just in this greenhouse gas reduction fund, was, yeah, but are there really projects for that? Like, show me the pipeline. So we said, all right, let's see if we can develop the pipeline. So we did a request for information about 5 months ago around the country, focused on forestry and wood products and water infrastructure. We got $7.4 billion worth of requests. I mean, I hit that the send button on the RFI. I was like closing one eye, being like, if this thing could be a massive failure. And people stepped up. We got $7.4 billion worth of project costs, $4.5 billion worth of actual financing need. And we have now focused that down to an investable pipeline of $1 billion. And so we are actively right now, and maybe a few of you have heard, we had an election a few weeks ago. Some of the lemonade has been money needs to move quickly. And so now conversations have accelerated to seeing how we can unlock some greenhouse gas reduction money to this investable pipeline of $1 billion. But what's fascinating about it is there's still all this perceived risk of forestry related practices. What are the actual benefits? How are we calculating that as an emissions reduction target? Some of the mass timber projects that we're seeing, I haven't really seen that pencil yet. Can you give us a little bit more? So right now, Quantified Ventures is playing this role, and we got 30 submissions from 35 states around the country, very focused on LIDEC. But this process right now, we're in this area here of like actually getting down to $1 billion worth of investable pipelines. We're working with the Coalition for Green Capital, one of the national green banks who received $5 or $6 billion, to see how we can make water and nature-based solution a critical part of their investment portfolio, to actually drive this outcome and show that this is possible so that we can reduce the perceived risk so that more money can flow into the projects we all care about that we know have greenhouse gas reduction benefits that maybe were not categorized at the beginning. And so we're working really hard on project performas. We're coming up with new ways to model out these projects to demonstrate how a capital stack with critical financing from Coalition for Green Capital could really start to drive this work forward so that we can develop a programmatic approach for the future and a really investable pipeline long term. Everyone loves to go second with this type of stuff. We've decided we're just going to lean in with many champions and really smart people around the country to see if we can drive this idea and maybe even work it into a portfolio and fund-based approach where we can start to actually have quick access to capital that can be mobilized quickly in a way that actually is de-risked and also has multiple payers. And so again, this is all focused on outcomes and looking at ways that we can start to translate opportunity into spaces that might not have been apparent at the very beginning. So with that, again, really appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and thanks for going on a little journey with me through these maybe non-traditional projects, but hopefully some of that resonated in all your work. So great, thanks.
Thanks a lot, Sean. That was excellent. Extremely informative presentation. We'll take a question from the room here. Yes, please. Introduce yourself.
Thanks. Mark Margulies from the Wharf District Council. On your green infrastructure initiative in DC, could you explain a little bit more how the capital comes to it and how the variable rates of return get paid out? It's an investment vehicle some kind, but I didn't understand how that actually works.
Yeah, great question. So we worked collaboratively with the investors, which there were a few, but the major investors were Calvert Foundation and Goldman Sachs, to come up with a rate that they felt like they could tolerate. It was deeply concessionary. It was like around 3 or 4 or 5%. But they were like, let's try something. We're willing to take that as like our foundational 95% confidence level. I think it went bumped up maybe a percentage point on the high end and maybe a percentage point on the and down on the low end. We actually took that capital and then floated a privately placed bond actually to raise the capital. So the securitization of that privately placed bond was the philanthropic or program related investment money that came in that allowed it to be deeply concessional, and then we were able to have that spread was enough for us to have the confidence to actually do the project. So that was the vehicle, was the privately placed environmental impact bond securitized by the investment from the investors. It was privately placed. We did the same approach in Buffalo that also was privately placed. The first publicly placed one we did was in Atlanta. And we had done 2 before, so we felt like we kind of knew who the landscape of potential buyers would be on this, and it actually was oversubscribed. So we were pleased by that. We wouldn't have started with that public offering on the first one, but felt like now we have enough to work on and feel confident that there's enough buyers out there.
I think we have some virtual questions coming in. Sorry, Sean, I'm just gonna sneak in here. Okay, looks like there is one from Kurt right there, if you want to ask that.
The question is, pleased to see you're kicking butt. Bringing 21st century thinking. It's a laudable comment from Kirk. 21st century thinking to climate resilience work. How are you dealing with the slow permitting systems affecting making the financial work?
Good to hear from you, Kurt, and thank you for that. I'll send you a check. The permitting process, slow, always has been slow. I don't think it's going to speed up anytime soon. But my first point here is this is the importance of bringing funding and financing in at the very beginning. So if you can have most of that capital stack set early in the process, you're then buffered and more resilient to changes and slowdowns later. And that's, I think, a really critical piece here is there's going to be many hiccups. Things are always going to be slow. You're going to get different challenges along the way. But having committed funding and financing early on is going to allow you to mitigate some of these slowdowns and actually demonstrate that this project is ready to go, which we have found that if that capital stack is really strong, it parts a bit and things move a little bit quicker. So I would say, Kurt, great question. But again, I think it just goes to my earlier point of making sure that you start to talk about funding and financing from the jump.
Great. We'll take 2 more questions. I think we're running short on time here. So Jasmine's coming over with the mic.
Thanks. I'm John Rich from Savin Hill in Dorchester. I worked for Carlton Ray, the DC WASA Blue Plains Clean Rivers Project director for 7.5 years before I retired. And you might have been the guy you were speaking with down there. But Carlton is a very forward, broad-thinking guy. And they brought in all of the green infrastructure proposals that were coming in were received positively. And it's because of the leadership which you found. I have a question about your sources for inspiration. What you described sounds like particularly the green infrastructure stuff, successful green infrastructure initiatives. The Democracy Collaborative did a really good study with Seattle on their green infrastructure program. And there's a lot of overlap there with regreening and improving the biosphere, not just with urban green infrastructure initiatives, but there's collaboration with Doug Tallamy from University of Delaware, Tallamy's Hub Homegrown National Park, which is this concept of massively reinstituting native species planted by homeowners, commercial property owners, municipalities, states, everywhere you have land where you can plant native species. The intent is to start reducing runoff, stormwater runoff, and just get the water back into the ground. Are those sources of research and action, or are they part of your group's background, part of your inspiration?
Absolutely. Yeah. We're always looking at science to drive our approaches. And, with this weird wonky financing stuff, a lot of people will prove it, and so we lean a lot on science to make the case that this stuff is real and is going to work. And a lot of times our financial models are based on the fact that it's going to perform as predicted. And we've got a lot of folks who are running alongside of us, putting their money up to say that it also will as well. And so we're leaning on science all the time. Also one thing is, as you were talking, that reminded me, and this goes to the idea of financing be a part of a critical part of the discussion as climate resilience. This passed a national climate assessment that was put out, the Northeast chapter. I was pleased to work with many academic partners, leading academics from around the Northeast part, all the way from West Virginia up through Maine. And we included financing as part of that chapter. It was the first time financing was ever part of a national climate assessment. The Northeast chapter took the lead on it, which we were really proud of. And I anticipate that future national climate assessments will have financing be a part of the science-based approach that report is focused on. And so I think that kind of makes the connection to what you're saying is right there, is that we're leaning on best available science to demonstrate that this stuff we're talking about is infrastructure, should be treated as such, and we actually understand how it's going to work. Exactly.
All right, that was an excellent remark. And thank you so much, Sean. For Kathleen, we'll hold your question for the panel discussion. In the interest of time, we'll just keep moving to the next speaker. Thank you so much.
Oh, we have so many mics, hard to choose. Thank you so much. I said at the beginning that I really wanted to learn things, and I don't know about you guys, but I've been learning a lot this morning. Also, I talked about creative solutions, and my goodness, if green cemetery is not a creative solution, I don't know what is. So somebody who wants to be planted as a tree, I was really interested in that. Another way, perhaps, another type of green infrastructure. Last, but certainly not least, in our program today is Joyce Coffey, who is founder and president of Climate Resilience Consulting. You can see her very extensive bio in the program, but among her 25 years of experience across all sectors, she has led the development of the first set of climate resilience principles for the financial services industry, and also co-developed the Ready for Resilience Toolkit, which I know I have looked at many a time in my work. She's also trained hundreds of practitioners in resilience finance. And I also learned, because I called it out for Rachel, I have to call out that I learned you are a jumbo. So at my grad school alma mater, Tufts University. So we have some connections there as well. So without further ado, Joyce, please join us.
I know. Okay, I guess I'll take one. Well, thank you, Carrie. So from so many things, including identifying that this one's turned off. Thank you, Carrie, for so many things, including identifying the jumbo connection. Just a show of hands, how many people in the room have some connection to Tufts University? Yeah, I mean, I just think that's so awesome. I'm not from here now, but celebrating the environmental work that all of you do, it's also really helpful for us to remind ourselves of our academic background. So anyway, my name is Joyce Coffey, and yes, as we just heard, I'm with Climate Resilience Consulting, and our aim in everything we do is to save lives and improve livelihoods in the face of climate change disruption. So we're focused clearly on climate change resilience, which is what most of the conversation today has been about. And today, I'm hoping that I can wrap us up a little bit by thinking together about how we can more effectively operate within the resilience funding and finance system, and to really identify some tools for how we better prepare to receive funding and finance for climate resilience building. And, huge shout out to Sean for so many things. I can't believe how you've turbocharged quantified ventures. It's incredible. And one thing you also really helped us to see is the need for urgency. So I think this better preparation starts yesterday, and we're working on it today, and we'll be there tomorrow. But I also want to be sure that we're talking a little bit today about equity. And by that I mean social and racial equity. Of course, we're also in this room talking about equity from the perspective of finance, but I want to bring us to a toolkit that was developed actually before the Inflation Reduction Act.
the quest for many local governments to create fundable projects was often resulting in plans that sat on a shelf, not in actually spade in the ground resilience. And so with funding from NOAA, the American Society of Adaptation Professionals and my firm created the Ready to Fund Resilience Toolkit, and it has also a technical paper and so on, and it's available to all of you. I do, encourage you to avail yourselves of it, and it gets better with time. I hope, by the way, that one outcome of our conversation today is that someone in this room or online, hi everybody there, decides to take on the Ready to Fund Resilience 2, because this was just the beginning, and so much progress has been made, as we've heard from the extraordinary panelists that have been on the stage today. What I'd like to do together, though, is to think a little bit about what we've heard so far from the perspective of these steps. So, by the way, the Ready to Fund Resilience Toolkit doesn't say you have to start at step 1 and go to step 10. It essentially says we invite you in wherever you are. So if you already have done the partnerships, or if you already have done racial equity work, maybe you don't have to focus on those as much as you get your project ready to fund resilience. So I was taking notes feverishly in the back about what was talked about with regard to each one of these steps. And I want to just remind us of some of these that came out of our conversations earlier today. I'm also going to ask at the end, if we have time, what I missed, because I haven't heard of many of these stories before, and maybe some of you already had. So I was doing my best, but I'm sure that there are things that were described by the other folks on the panel that I didn't catch. For instance, Rachel, you really helped us to understand the importance of building multi-sector partnerships, including because you identified the co-benefit of health, public health. So bringing in public health stakeholders can also bring in funding and finance. Further, you helped us to think about how to secure community and government buy-in when you talked about Portland. And you said, doing the economic analysis means that you look at your largest employers, your tax revenue, your assets, such as your physical and social and economic assets. You pointed out, for instance, places of worship, schools, and that sort of thing, commuting, supply and shipping, emergency routes. So you really helped us to think about community buy-in from these different sectors. And you also talked about equity when you mentioned the populations of concern, for instance, low-income residents and rural residents. So let's remember, in a new era with a different president, that rural work is equity work, along with working with elderly, working with the young, and of course, working with those who have been underserved and traditionally are hit first and worst by climate change risks, which are Black and Indigenous people in America. You also talked about how to co-create with residents through, for instance, the York County project, where you were developing away from vulnerable. There were many things that the York County people suggested. The one that I picked up on was they think that maybe development should happen away from vulnerable areas. I'm just looking out at this gorgeous span here and thinking, wow, it would be cool if there were lots of residents that asked of that. But it is, by the way, gorgeous here. And I'm so glad that we're in this amazing space from Foley Hoag. Thank you for including us. So Rebecca, you talked a little bit about these points of multi-sector partnerships, because that is what you lead. So the Green Ribbon Commission is an extraordinary example, and anyone listening online or in the room that works in other places, do follow in the Green Ribbon Commission's footsteps, borrow and steal everything they've done, because it does make a big difference to have this public-private, nonprofit, philanthropic group thinking through projects together and prioritizing them. And I'm going to share a little bit more about what I heard there from the perspective of, how it means, what it means for some of these other steps when we get to them. Scott, I was really intrigued by the fact that everything you described was public-private partnership. And in particular, the aim for this Alewife pre-development work or the Alewife Joint Development, TOD, is, I think, something we're all going to be watching carefully around the nation. And it's very cool that you're sharing with us in your first step, because often things are done already. And we're like, well, how did you get people together? Like, whose idea was it? I mean, and what you described, what I heard was, it came from you as a civil servant, along with the creativity of the governor, but also of a really dear partnership with a city. So, I mean, that kind of stuff, okay, that's a golden gem to take away from this conversation. I'm going to work my contacts to try to create something similar and then follow perhaps a very fast follow behind Scott as you continue this process. You also talked about how that partnership with IRAM and the city of Cambridge helped to really secure the community buy-in. In this case, you were talking about the community buy-in, but let's not forget what Iran described in terms of buy-in. She said that a project in Kendall Square would, and I had to go back and ask her these numbers a little bit then because I couldn't quite believe it. It would impact positively 160,000 residents and have a $60 billion benefit because the assets that will be protected by these 9 projects, like pumps around a dam or barriers to protect food distribution and other projects that she wasn't able to name because she didn't have time, would essentially protect $90 billion in that, fast developing, dense, and important part of Cambridge. So that's really amazing. That's a lot of residents to have interacted with or be working with. And, it's laudable and also a lot of work. So I'm going to go on now to thinking through a few, and Sean, I'll be sure to come back to you in a moment, but let's go on to a couple of these other characteristics. So innovative accounting practices. I'm going to come back to this in a moment, but the fact is that climate change resilience is very hard to fund and finance if you compare it to climate change mitigation. So I just want to come back to Scott. You pointed out, for instance, some EV work that you're doing. We in the resilience space are so envious of electric vehicles, renewable energy, energy efficiency. There is bank in that work. You can make money when you do something with energy. And for instance, you can charge people for electric charging, even if right now it might be a public good, or you charge people for their energy. You can't as easily charge people for a flood-free alewife parking lot. And so that's the challenge of resilience, is how to make bank. And Quantified Ventures has figured it out. So I think we can ask Sean a lot more questions along the way, but we're going to come back to this bankability point in a little bit. There's also, I think, anything to do with public-private partnerships is often a really helpful way to think about diversifying funding sources. And we heard about partnering with Suffolk Downs and their payment in, also from Scott. And we also heard from Scott and several others about the value of including affordable housing as part of your resilience projects. There is a lot of public money for affordable housing, but affordable housing is some of the most risky housing from the perspective of the physical impacts of climate change. Because as I mentioned earlier, those who are disproportionately impacted by climate change are typically the poor, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So we have a lot of affordable housing that's going to be inundated or is already in the wildfire urban interface. And we will therefore need to find more affordable housing in other parts of the United States as people leave from very traumatic situations. But in the meantime, affordable housing can be a great way to essentially bundle projects to help create resilience, because there is money from HUD and other places for affordable housing work. I think it's also really interesting to hear a little bit from the perspective of diversifying funding sources about these really interesting sources of funding that Quantified Ventures puts forward. So I hadn't heard about green burials. That is amazing. And we also know that you've now carried the DC water case to 3 different communities. And I think that there are many others that will find that a useful system, and maybe even be able to do it without the input of a Quantified Ventures. Like you're creating templates that are usable by others. But in the meantime, having a privately placed bond is also really fantastic. I'm going to come back to the moment of bonds for a moment in just a little bit, because there is one word that only one person has spoken here. And I am going to say we need to kick butt. I'm going to kick all of your butts and say it needs to be talked about a lot more. And that is the word TAX. Tax. Climate resilience is generally a public good. And when we make sense for climate resilience, that's how we're going to pay for it. We're going to have to make sense. We're going to have to tax people. It's part of the deal. And I'm just surprised it didn't come up more. So I have a slide near the end that will bring it to bear a little bit further. So a few more things here. Let me just see. So I just want to point out a couple other things that I think were really important to understand. For instance, the Department of Defense is a huge climate resilience actor. I mean, they are trying to protect our military from extreme heat. So much of their work is stopped due to wildfire risks. You can't be practicing on a firing range if it's close to a wildfire, potential risks, as an example. And of course, our military bases all around the US and around the world face flooding and drought and other risks. So I think it's really interesting to align yourself with government plans from even perhaps unexpected actors. And I mean that not only from the federal government, but also the state government and the city government. And I think that kind of brings us back around to the question of building multi-sector partnerships, because the sectors may also be different departments within your work. So, Rachel, you talked about health, we've talked about affordable housing. Those may not be the environment department or the environment leader or this incredible mayor's office, Mayor Wu, who's just dedicated a new staff member to climate and resilience. But you could find that would be the multi-sector work that you need to do. I did want to pause for a moment on the question of how Mayor Wu has funded her climate czar, which I don't think is their title, but I'm just going to use that here for a moment. What we understand is that from Rachel, that she funded that through Rebecca, through basically finding another position in the city and retitling it. And that's really great, but not everybody is going to have the ability to do that. And also it does mean that some resources somewhere else don't have that person any longer. So funding public officials, and empowering them can be a really huge part of how we make sense for climate resilience. So I mentioned that I was going to talk a little bit more about bankability. It's really, really important that we understand that when we're talking about finance anyway, it is part of the capital system. And the definition of capital is that it makes profit. So when we are thinking about climate change resilience, we need to be thinking about how our projects can make some profit, some revenue stream. Making them bankable will make them possible. So at the Paris climate talks many years ago now, there was so much talk about greenhouse gas mitigation. But if you read the Paris Climate Agreement, adaptation comes out more frequently than mitigation. And it's always frustrated me. Why is that? So after I wasn't in the big room, but I was somewhere, in the very back, and there was a big time speaker. And I asked him at the end as he was rushing off to the bathroom, why didn't you say anything about adaptation? And he said, well, it's not bankable. Like, obviously, girl, why would you ever say anything about adaptation? You can't talk about that at a big climate conference. There's no money to be made in it. So I think that's a real challenge that all of us have as adaptation leaders, is to figure out, well, what is it? How do you make money for paying back debt or for attracting private investors in your resilience projects? And I feel like we've seen that in the work that we heard about from the MTA. And certainly that is, I don't know if that's part of your holy grail, Sean, at Quantified Ventures, but it seems as though it is, that, bankability is part of the deal. And it does come in with blended finance, right? Philanthropy may play a role in buying down some of the risk in order for private investors, for instance, to be more interested. But I'm keen for us to think about that a little bit further. And instead of going through the cases, since I know we're close to wanting to, by the way, I call my parking lot compost. So the green barrels are really cool. I think that's the bomb. But I didn't think I was going to need to talk about this because I thought it was going to come up in other speakers, but I was asked to sort of have some additional slides on hand in case a couple of things weren't addressed. And I am struck by the fact that we haven't talked a lot about how you generate money. In the United States, we have the federal government that can have huge trillion-dollar debt. But that's really the only government in the US that can have that kind of debt. Everybody else has to balance their budgets. And we don't have a World Bank, or an Asian Development Bank or United Nations. We don't have groups that fund in the US for development projects. So in order for government to finance projects, they need to raise their utility rates. They need to establish new taxes or increase taxes. They need to put surcharges on certain things, and they need to figure out ways to increase fees. And because climate change requires us to actually mitigate risk. It requires us to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, number one. Mitigating risk of climate change is really a very big public problem, like government problem. We're going to have to do these things more because, the risk's here today more than it was yesterday, and it's going to be here much more tomorrow. So I'm sorry that I have to be the bearer of that news, but all of us as leaders need to figure out how we can find the interest from the public in increasing taxes. And there are examples. Just for a moment, remind yourself that in Virginia, there is a resilience penny that has been assessed on property. Let me see, actually, I think I pulled it up here really quick. So the resilience penny is a 1 cent increase in property taxes per $100 of assessed value in Norfolk, Virginia. Norfolk, very low income. Norfolk, big naval base. And, they found the way to pass this. And this was passed like 3 years ago, or maybe even longer, actually. The funds from the resilience penny are used for stormwater, and they're used specifically for stormwater in places that have a lot of affordable housing. So it's not impossible to do it. It's really valuable for us to think about it. Another thing that I like to think about, because I used to work for a mayor, is what can the next mayor be responsible for? So when I was working for Mayor Daley, the city's water department assessed an increase in our water rates, but it wasn't to go into effect for 5 years. So that was going to be either the current mayor's next administration, but he still wouldn't have to think about it, or some other mayor's problem. So, when we talk about urgency, this kind of tax increase can take years. Today is the day to increase the amount that we are paying for some of these things. And I want to come back to something that Iram said that I really believe is true. And that is that we have to do it today because we are sending our kids and their kids into such an extraordinarily disorganized and complex space with climate risks. If we don't take on the increase in taxes, and if we don't take on the debt, they are going to bear an even bigger burden. So it's actually a values-based decision to think about increasing taxes today in order to pay for, and increasing rates or surcharges, other things, in order to pay for the stuff that goes in the ground today that will protect us for tomorrow. And that's, I guess, where I want to end, which is in this quest for debt. So when we think about debt-based investments like general obligation bonds, which is, I think, what funded a lot of this. I don't actually know, but I presume general obligations bonds, which come from your property taxes generally. In most places, sometimes it comes from other tax sources. Revenue bonds, which come from, for instance, like a water management department, they get revenue, and then they can set up a bond with that initial cash from the rates that we pay as water users. Green bonds, which is some of the work that Quantified Venture leads, otherwise known as environmental impact bonds. And green bonds is sort of I know Iran was also bummed that she had to call something green when she wanted to call it cool. We could also call green bonds social impact bonds. This is where you have perhaps the kind of investors, like we heard from Sean at Quantified Ventures, who are willing to take on risk for less return than they might otherwise. So that was the Calvert Foundation example that he gave. And of course, TIF, tax increment financing, is another method of financing projects. But in any case, all of these methods help us to pay for things today that will pay back by avoiding loss in the future. And I do want to come back to where you started, which was, I think you said an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And then you said, for every dollar spent, you save 6. I like to say a stitch in time saves 9, because I think that we actually are getting more than $6 in benefit for avoiding losses. If you look at some other data, for instance, from the insurance industry, it goes up to $14 to $16 for every dollar invested. So a stitch in time saves 9. A dollar spent can save $9 in loss in the future. And the thing that is so profoundly important for us when we think about this is that this is very different as a finance person thinking about avoided loss from your cost benefit analysis perspective. Because generally, when we're thinking about these very large projects that a city might invest in, for instance, like a bridge, the minute that the bridge is constructed, it begins to lose value. It depreciates, right? Because the tensile strength of the steel is assumed to, go down over time, or the integrity of the cement go down over time. But when you're putting in place something that is explicitly for climate change resilience, and also has all sorts of other collateral benefits. That whatever you're building actually increases in value over time because the risks increase over time. So the risks the impacts it's preventing grow. So in other words, if you put in a seawall today or some sort of sea barrier with money from a general obligation bond, it might not have as much value today as it will when you have the 7 feet of sea level rise that I heard one of the roadways in Boston is being modeled for. So anyway, all to say that it's our time to pay a little bit more for these resilience benefits. And I'm so glad that you've all joined us today to think a little bit more about how we can make sense for climate resilience and adaptation. Thanks.
Joyce, that was fascinating. That was such an excellent wrap up of all the speakers. You combined the essence of all the points that were made. That was great. We do have time for questions for Joyce. Jessamine, I'm looking at you. Do we have time for questions for Joyce?
We do.
Yes.
1 or 2.
We'll take questions in the room and then we'll go to the virtual room. Yes.
Thank you so much for that, Joyce. My name is Emma Gildas-Game. I still work for the Nature Conservancy. My question is, so I'm really grateful that you bring up the fact that we all have to pay for this, that this is a social good. And I also recognize that the costs of reacting to climate change are disproportionately, as you mentioned, borne by the people who honestly contribute least to climate change. Over the last few years, TNC and many other partners who are here in the room and not worked on an equitable climate funding program for Massachusetts. And one of the big things that we heard is a lot of these funding mechanisms can be really regressive and can really harm communities that are least resilient economically to even a small increase in costs. And so I was wondering if you had any thoughts. I really appreciated that you spoke about equity from the beginning. How does equity play into the way that we can structure this funding that we desperately need and we all need to pay more for, but those of us with more need to also pay more? So how do we do that?
Yeah, that is a great question. I don't have the ultimate set of what to do's, but the first thing we do is what you did. And that is to understand that the finance system is also not fair. So in other words, tax is generally regressive. So if we just put that out there and we say we need to fund this with tax or we need to fund this with an increase in water rates, but that's regressive and therefore will create more inequity. And so we have to figure out a way to avoid that increase in both disproportionate risk, but also increased inequity. So knowing that that's an aim of any kind of capital stack, of any kind of project, I just come back to, because Sean's sitting right behind you, the point that the finance question comes up in the very first conversation. And so the equitable finance question should also come up then. And therefore, you would put in place, for instance, you might say that a portion of your community has to remain a certain percent of affordable housing. And some of that housing will be paid for by government, or you're going to incent developers to have affordable housing. So that there's some sort of land use quest on that. You might say that we're going to have a tiered pricing structure for our water rates, and the lowest tier is going to be very, very inexpensive, but also low. And we're going to pair that with a huge water efficiency plan that targets lower income owners and renters. And then you are able to go to the next tier where the more wealthy people are paying through the nose for the water, including paying a little bit more than a lower income person might for their water. I think there's a couple people from universities here. The question that you asked would be an incredible, very applicable research project to figure out how to avoid regression in the increases in taxes and fees that we need in the future and today. So good question. There was a question here about the role of the insurance sector. So could I just take that
Perfect.
from the—
I was going to direct you to that, but you saw it.
Great. Well, so the question generally is there a role for the insurance sector in climate resilience funding and finance? And if so, what is it? There are so many roles. One is that insurance is a huge market signal. If your insurance goes up really a lot, you might think twice about, reinvesting in the home that you currently own or buying a home in a place where the insurance costs are so high that you can't think about that as an extra expense. This is happening already with wildfire insurance in California. And very high net worth people are actually left with assets that they're worried about because no one's going to be able to afford not only the property that they might want to sell at what they bought it for, but also the insurance that they're now having to pay if they're lucky enough to have been, insured for wildfire. So anyway, it's a huge price signal. Of course, the federal government for flooding gets in the way of that price signal because the National Flood Insurance Program pays out even if you are, especially if you are flooded and you are uninsured. Of course, that is also a very inequitable system. I think we all know that wealthy people receive much more federal flood recovery money than lower income people do. But anyway, the insurance industry could play a huge role, a bigger role, a growing role in our land use choices, but through its price signal. Number two, the insurance industry has some really innovative products like parametric insurance, which is, as its name, parametric. It's a by measure insurance product. So instead of having to send in a claim when I have flooding in a park in my city, if I'm the city government and I'm insured in that park, or maybe it's flooding of a city-owned parking lot, I will simply get the payout if I have a parametric policy that says if it rains this much in 4 days, the money comes into our coffers. Another really cool use of a parametric policy is overseas for lower income people, women who are typically working outside in India as trash collectors or vendors. They have, and this is backed up as some of the quantified venture projects are by philanthropy. They have a parametric insurance policy that pays them every time the temperature goes over like 100 degrees. So it means that they don't have to go outside and do the work that would potentially put them at grave risk of both morbidity and mortality. So there's another example of an insurance product that is very, very specifically focused on lower income people and helping to save their lives in the face of extreme heat, which of course we all know is the biggest killer. We don't talk about it as much in finance because it's not as infrastructure related, we think. But of course, having cooler places and having cheaper air conditioning, which is absolutely a climate resilient strategy that we all have to buy into, is a huge part of a paid extreme heat strategy and mitigation strategy. But one other thing I want to say about insurance companies is that they are part of the finance industry and they have a huge bank themselves. Like they have a lot of money that they have to invest. This is the money that we pay in for our policies, our premiums. And so they could be investing that money in resilience. You'd kind of imagine that would be a good idea because it would decrease the amount of insured losses. But what I mentioned earlier is that, the private sector, the whole deal with the private sector is what? They have to earn a profit. So in fact, it's not always to an insurance company's benefit to decrease risk if it means that people will have lower requests for policy. So it is to their benefit if decreasing risks mean they have to do fewer payouts. So that's where parametric policies and other things, I think that kind of structure was really, really important. And I'm inspired by the question. I'm also really inspired that if you had asked me this question like 4 years ago, I would have said, well, there's not a lot. I don't know. The insurance company isn't doing very much. They are doing a lot now. And they're scared too. Their book looks a lot different because of all the risks that we've already experienced. So good question.
Thank you, Joyce. With that, that was an excellent question and an extremely insightful answer. So with that, we'll request our panelists, please, to come up here and we'll have each of you settled in with a microphone. Yeah, I think. I think as we get settled in, I'd like to start the panel. First of all, thank you all again for this excellent discussion this morning. We've learned so much from each of you all today, such insightful thoughts and ideas and strategies, everything that we can take back to our projects, to our communities that we work with state agencies and entities that we work with. So thank you really again for that. I think one of the things that we would really like to, and this is probably one of a general question that I would like to open up for this panel discussion. What do you see, and this probably is going to be directed to each one of you, is what do you see as some of the most significant barriers as that practitioners face when trying to secure funding for resilience projects, and how would we address those? And I don't know how we started. I'm happy to start at either side of the table or in the middle, whoever, if you want to raise your hand, or Scott or Joyce or Scott. Great.
I'll be really quick. Top of the mind, bureaucracy. It's difficult, and we in government need to find ways to move quicker, take advantage of opportunities, partnering, as well as government funding and whatnot, and get the money on the street. There has been some talk about the change in administrations and some threats that might be there. There's some good things happening as a result of that. We look at the funding that we have gotten from the federal government the last 4 years. It's just been unbelievable how much discretionary funds have come our way. There are people working so hard now to commit those dollars and obligate those dollars. And through that, they're learning to break through some of the bureaucracy to get that money on the street. And I hope that through that, those are lasting changes to the way we do business.
I've no shortage of barriers. One that pops to mind that I didn't mention and I also didn't hear is also the way that our industry and sector has grown up, and how it's perceived. Like in the outside world, like we do like birds and bunnies stuff. And like that I've heard so much is like, oh, well, I got this $100,000 grant. And then like 10 years later, you've cobbled together enough. And so like this idea of shifting this mindset from grant by grant by grant to this idea of thinking about how do we stack multiple sources of capital that can include grants, but also financing, has not been part of our collective DNA. And so I think there's like a gap in understanding and knowledge and expertise that we're all learning together that's going to be critically important to be able to accelerate projects. So some of the other, like the energy and sector that Joyce mentioned, and I have extreme jealousy of the mitigation side, like they've been able to move a lot faster. And so I think there's a learning up in education and us being able to grow up into like, how do we understand capital markets and financing and infrastructure finance to be able to move our projects faster is a critical barrier that I think we're starting to scratch at.
I guess it's my turn. So I will I'll point to Sean and say bankability, I think is the big one. But from a main perspective, I would say sclerosis, which is basically, we haven't done it this way before. Why should we change the way we do things now?
So those are awesome answers. For me, I feel really strongly that the biggest barrier is the scale of the problem and the fact that the problem is growing. And the growth is not just because of the increase in climate risk, it's also because of our increasing interest in developing along the coasts and in developing in areas that are too close to the wildfire urban interface, and in developing in areas that don't have good water security. So we're just really writing a book for ourselves of incredible increase in trauma in our communities and increase in cost, ultimately borne by the public, as more assets are literally or figuratively underwater. And so that is a policy issue, and it relates to voracious appetite for new start housing in green places, and it relates to a voracious desire to be along the coasts and along rivers' edges. But I don't know exactly what will turn it around. We did hear from you that Maine kind of has been inspired by having big impacts, like that drove change. And I've definitely heard that from other places, but the data don't show that. So, Florida is developing like crazy and redeveloping like crazy, as an example, just one. I mean, they're not the only ones, right? So I think it's interesting that we talk about that in the resilience space, like, well, when the big one hits, people change their behavior in terms of their land use, but it actually isn't true. That's a big one for me.
For all your comments on that. For all your comments on that question. We have a question in the virtual room here again addressed to the panel. Given that the first environmental impact bond was done 7 years ago and social impact bonds have been around for a while, how can we scale up and mainstream these solutions to make both government and investors more comfortable with them as options? It's an excellent question. Sean, do you want to go first?
That was probably for me. So let me take I think environmental impact bonds are an approach. It has been a mechanism that works in a few places, but I would challenge that it is like the golden ticket. It's like a approach that could work in some places. A regulatory driver is like a major component of why an environmental impact bond could be appropriate. I would say the thing we can scale up more quickly than, say, an environmental impact bond, which will take a long time to develop. They got to pay entities like Quantified Ventures. Yes, we're trying to develop templates in order for other people can do it, but it takes a long time. You got to go find the investors. There is a lot of money floating around that already exists in municipalities and local government that could just be redeployed in different ways to accomplish the intent of that money, but also do more. So, we think about housing projects as a water project with a roof. We think about energy projects as habitat corridors. We think about transportation projects, which are typically the largest budget in any agency, state or local. Think about those projects as stormwater projects that happen to have a paved roadway between the green infrastructure. You start to think about that and how that capital flows year over year. Typically, capital improvement plans and transportation departments are 10-year windows, right? And that money is fairly well secured, especially when it's federally capitalized. Thinking about using mechanisms like they're called Garvey bonds, bond anticipation notes, to say, what if we took out what we anticipate receiving over a 10-year window and actually do it sooner to be able to achieve those outcomes sooner? That could be a resilience benefit. So yes, there's new ways of accessing capital. I'm a huge fan of the environmental impact bonds, but I don't want to always think about innovation being the new whiz-bang thing. We also think we need to look at innovation being how do we redeploy and reorganize the resources that we currently have to have better and more outcomes for the problems that we're trying to solve.
I would just add one thing. To that. In the globe, we have the Climate Bonds Initiative. Maybe some of you have heard of that. And they put out principles that help you as an investor. I'm talking about big investors here, not us, investing in our household portfolios, but like Goldman Sachs and those folks to understand how they should test a potential project to see if it's investable. So they have, for instance, forest investment principles. They have, transportation investment principles. And several years ago, they put out a set of climate resilience principles. And I think they're really pretty interesting. I was part of that first tier, but what's most interesting is that they were in demand enough that they actually have now gone to a second era of those principles and created a brand new set of them. So the Climate Bond Initiative, look on their website and find their resilience principles and see how they talk to investors about green bonds. In this case, climate resilience green bonds. It's a little different from the environmental impact bond because it's not so much about that, being willing to have a lower rate of return. A green bond is in fact market rate. And it's just sold to a set of investors as something that would help with their, diversification of their portfolio, essentially.
Great, we'll take questions from the audience here. I know you had your hand raised for an earlier question, so
Thank you. Hi, my name is Vidhi Garg, HRNA Advisors. Sean, my question's for you. In your presentation, you talked about water infrastructure projects as part of GGRF. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about the kinds of projects, the $1 billion pipeline that you're looking at, and then how are you assembling that capital stack other than, say, GGRF money?
Yeah, I would love to chat with you after. Lots of this stuff is like happening right now. Like phone is like blowing up with these exact questions. So would love to chat. And I know that your firm has been working in this space for a while. In this first round of trying to generate an investable pipeline, we focused on municipal water infrastructure / utilities. Given the security of the revenue stream, it really helps our blended portfolio
when you start, and all of our approach for this GGRF money is going to, one thing we've learned very quickly is that large investors have zero interest in investing in singular projects. They were like, yeah, that's really cute, but like, what is your book of projects? What does your pipeline look like? We're like, oh, right, yeah, we'll get back to you with that. So like right now we're at the point of actually blending in a variety of risky projects. The municipal water projects are at the very like secure. And then we've got other ones that are more like family forest related carbon projects on the other end. And so we're thinking about water infrastructure right now at the utility side. We're also weaving in like leaky pipes as another way of like less water treated, less energy used, like some of this idea of translation, investing in watershed-based approaches. So there's less water that makes its way all the way to the bottom of the hill at the wastewater treatment plants, and did some of that work in Rhode Island as well. Where that's the kind of first tranche of projects is going to largely be utility based. But I could see a world where we're starting to look at restoration projects, watershed scale projects. It just the speed we're trying to go. Those were projects that were already ready to go, had municipal bonds associated with them, and just needed to fill a gap.
Question, yes, please, Rebecca.
Thanks, Jasmine. I'm wondering if this is mostly a question for Joyce and Sean, but I'm curious about if you've seen any places where people are thinking about financing heat resilience, and if there are ways to like bring in health insurers, particularly given the cost of electricity, and that for so many people, even if they have an air conditioner, they can't afford to run it. So, how do we think about heat resilience in the private realm, not just in the public realm, with, better canopies or tree canopies or misters or things like that?
Yeah, we're both looking at each other. We're both looking at each other. I'm hoping that one or the other has the right answer to this question, because I don't know a lot of them, but I will say that number one, generally what I have seen is the public sector giving away air conditioning to a very small set of people, like 1,000 to 3,000 people got air conditioners in the Washington state heat waves 3 years ago. That's like a drop in the bucket. And the problem is that when they are given away, they are not given money, the families, to pay for the air conditioning, which I know you know well is the major issue. And maybe they're given, for instance, a pass on having to pay their bills for a few months, but it always comes back to bite them. And so some families maybe even received a free air conditioning and they didn't put it on, and they experienced either morbidity or mortality. Like there's a very interesting study about that. So I did give an example earlier about an insurance product that's around heat, which I think is really interesting for us to think about translating here. But otherwise, the point, by the way, that heat resilience needs to also happen in the household is so important, because of course our bodies cool in a 24-hour cycle. So if we're an outdoor worker and we don't have OSHA or anyone paying attention to our physical health in our job in the factory or in the farm field or in the construction project, and we come home and we have no air conditioning, then it's, those are the people who end up in the emergency room or worse. So I'm glad you're asking the question. If anyone else in the audience has a good answer, we'd love to hear it.
It's an awesome question. And one of the things that I get really excited about the work we do at QV is that we have a health side and a climate side. And so I think we're uniquely positioned, and we haven't figured out how to do this yet. And we have deep relationships with many of the states and the larger healthcare providers around the country. We're scratching at this in Detroit and Kentucky and a little bit in Miami right now, using urban forests as a heat mitigation strategy, with health providers as an investor. We have had trouble organizing around the time. So planting tree, getting benefit, being able to actually demonstrate the causality of the tree planting equal better health outcomes, like that duration's like, 15, 20 years. And that's assuming that the typical mortality of a urban tree is 7 years. It was like, it's really hard. And that goes back to that science question. We're trying to demonstrate that there's a clear linkage. And that conversation has advanced, but we haven't got there yet. But I think there's progress.
The other thing that just reminded me is, as Joyce was mentioning, when we did the resilient roadie strategy in Rhode Island, we were looking at all of these like ways that we could just flip a different lever in order to have better resilience outcomes. And one of the opportunities around urban heat and cooling was the LIHEAT programs, the low income heating assistance programs. They were like, oh, well, it's just for heat. And everyone's like, oh, you got to have these assessments done in the house, and there's weatherization, and it's part of the program. There's another box in there that's like, do you want cooling assistance? And the large majority of the states around the country just never check the cooling box because they just don't know what to do. So there's like all these other little mechanisms in there that allow for like existing programs to start accessing cooling programs, just because it just has always been done one way and no one ever plan to look at the form again. So interesting stuff like that.
The other thing about that is, so in more immediate term, municipalities, I think, need to invest in cooling centers. So for their populations, not as sexy maybe as planting a tree, but there you are.
Those were great. That was a great question, but some really helpful tips and responses there. We'll take one last question, really, in the interest of time, and I'm going to combine a question in the chat with something that I had penned down as one of the questions as well. And I'm probably going to start directing this a little bit to Scott, and then also have others weigh in your input, please. But the question was broadly related to what would you recommend as the next step would be for municipalities working closely with state agencies looking to fund resilience work, and what can other what sort of lessons learned can other cities and perhaps smaller communities can take from this example, Scott, that you and Iram spoke about with the Cambridge MBTA collaboration of integrating resilience into infrastructure and particularly transportation transit projects?
There's a lot there. I failed to mention that Governor Healy and Lieutenant Governor Driscoll, they created the first in the nation climate czar. I think it's Melissa Hoffer. I've never met her, and Melissa and her team, and I can tell you, they're very much part of MassDOT and MBTA's planning. They're very accessible to the communities, to work with the communities to find out what their needs are. Whether we're MassDOT project or MBTA, we really want to work with our host communities and understand what their needs are when we're meeting our needs. And most often they're collective needs. So we try and respect their the issues. They're on the ground. It's their communities, and they can teach us a lot about what happens and how water flows, or how where runoff goes, or what kind of whatever I can't remember the word I'm looking for. But so that's the big key is really working with the municipalities. We have the MBTA Communities Act. So we at the MBTA, while that's a development and zoning thing, we want to make sure people know that we're open for business. If our property can help you meet your needs, we're there for you on that. But certainly, as we look at whatever we do, we want to make sure we're doing it in an environmentally sensitive way.
Awesome. I would encourage us also to discuss like economic development, and again, this is this like translation idea about talking with governors. And if I lean on Rhode Island experience, one of the main connection points to actually making progress on policy as well as additional funding and financing for climate resilience work was when we started to link directly, when I learned that Governor Raimondo, not surprisingly, most governors are like driving economic development to their state. And we started to link that a better prepared municipalities would equal a better prepared Rhode Island. And that would mean that businesses could keep their doors open longer and more continuously. And so when we had a couple of major proposals that we were putting out to have large corporations potentially be sited in Rhode Island, a big portion of the proposals that we developed were around how the state was dealing with continuity, resilience, flooding reduction, so that those businesses could be assured that they weren't going to get wiped out in a storm or major intersections weren't going to be flooded. And so I think that idea of translation, but economic development being a major driver to unlocking future business potential. And that's another payer opportunity as well. We're doing this somewhere right outside of your hometown in Illinois, Joyce, is looking at disruption in transportation corridors for large corporations in the Midwest. And Illinois is one of our major conversations right now is, could corporations start to pay in as like a sub fund, which then we could leverage against in order to be able to have the state then provide additional capital. So I think that connection to private business and having that be able to communicate with state leaders is critical.
Yeah, absolutely. And then piggybacking on that, in the presentation that I gave earlier, we talked about looking at the economic base. What's your economic base? Where are people? Where are the main commuting patterns? And so tying that to economic development and saying that a dollar spent on resilience is actually more than a dollar spent on economic development, I think is probably a good way to go.
And something about the question made me think that maybe the questioner was working from the perspective of a smaller community or a town. One thing I've noticed in working with smaller towns is that they're quite allergic to debt. You'll talk to a council member and he'll say, "We have no debt." And he's so proud of that. And I think there is perhaps a need for a frame shift. Like, actually, we took on debt because I care about my grandkids' future. I want them to be able to live in this place. And so we're going to be building some things that are going to make that possible. And that's just a very different way to lead if you're in a small town that doesn't have debt and has never had debt and hasn't ever even had a credit rating. They have no relationship with Standard & Poor's or Moody's, because that's the first thing that has to happen if you're going to take on debt is, well, not the first, but one of the first things is that you've got someone from, Wall Street that is coming to a meeting with you to say, I need to know what your liquidity is, what your economic profile looks like. What is your prospect for paying back this potential debt that you're going to be taking on? And typically for small towns, it's actually pretty good if they haven't had debt before, So I think that that's something that we should be thinking about a little bit more, is how to help smaller communities understand the value of paying now to protect the future for our kids.
Also, municipalities, thank you for that. Also, municipalities can work together as well. There's a big payback to regional cooperations. So you don't have to do it alone.
I feel like we could probably go on and on, but unfortunately we are at time here. Those are such insightful questions, remarks, responses. We're just so grateful to have you all as speakers. A big round of applause to our speakers and panelists today. With that, Anne, I'll hand it off to you.
That's me, although the microphone, there you go. Thank you all for coming. Quickly to get you out of here, big round of applause to everybody for being here, to all of our speakers for speaking today, to Indrani and Carrie for coordinating and doing all the outreach, to all the steering committee members who are here today and past steering committee members, the organizers, everybody involved is fantastic. There are yellow sheets on your tables. We use the feedback we get as a steering committee. We use these to generate topics and ideas for future forums. So leave us all your thoughts and opinions and feelings on the little yellow sheets, and we will use them to generate ideas for future forums. We have March and June coming up next year. We're generating those ideas now, but we'll get all of that communicated out to you via email. We'll get you the PowerPoint presentations, probably 5-ish business days. The webinar recording, we do a little bit of editing, and then we'll get it out to you again, 5 business days or so, directly into your inbox. You don't have to look for it. I think that's it. There's a feedback survey link in the chat for the virtual people. Anything else? Wonderful. Have a great lunch and a good rest of your Friday.